Harry Potter had learned through 10 years of careful observation that Thursday mornings at number 4, Privet Drive followed a pattern as reliable as clockwork. Uncle Vernon would lumber down the stairs at exactly 7:15, his moustache bristling with the self-importance that came from managing a drill company. Aunt Petunia would already be in the kitchen, her thin neck stretched like a crane's as she peered through the lace curtains at the neighbors' houses, cataloguing any infractions against suburban propriety. And Dudley would still be upstairs, snoring through the alarm that had been bleating uselessly for the past 20 minutes. This Thursday was no different, except for the owl. Harry first spotted it through his bedroom window as he pulled on yesterday's oversized t-shirt, one of Dudley's cast-offs that hung on him like a grey tent. The bird sat perched on the garden fence, a tawny shape against the morning sky, and there was something in its bearing that made Harry pause. Owls didn't usually visit Privet Drive. Mrs. Figg had cats, the Dursleys had no pets at all, and the neighbourhood's idea of wildlife extended no further than the occasional hedgehog. The owl had something tied to its leg. Harry pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the window. The bird turned its head with that eerie, almost human movement owls had, and looked directly at him. For a moment, boy and bird regarded each other through the glass, and Harry felt something shift in his chest. A recognition, perhaps. A sense that this ordinary Thursday morning was about to become something else entirely. From downstairs came the familiar sounds of Uncle Vernon's breakfast ritual. The scrape of his chair, the rustle of the newspaper, the pointed clearing of his throat that meant he expected his coffee to appear without delay. Aunt Petunia's footsteps clicked across the kitchen tiles in sharp, efficient movements. The owl spread its wings and took flight. Harry was halfway down the stairs when he heard the post slot clatter. But instead of the usual bills and advertisements tumbling onto the mat, there came a different sound, a soft thud, as if something heavier had been pushed through. He reached the bottom of the stairs just as Uncle Vernon emerged from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, moving toward the front door with the purposeful stride of a man intent on destroying whatever the Morning Post might bring. But Harry was faster. 10 years of dodging Dudley's ham-fisted attempts at violence had made Harry quick on his feet. He darted around Uncle Vernon, snatched the thick envelope from the mat, and was back at the foot of the stairs before his uncle could do more than sputter in outrage. "Boy, give that here." Harry looked down at the envelope in his hands. It was made of heavy parchment, yellowed with age, and his name was written across the front in emerald green ink. Not just his name, his full name, and something more. Mr. H. Potter. The cupboard under the stairs. 4 Privet Drive. Little Whinging Surrey. He stared at those words, the cupboard under the stairs, and felt his stomach clench. Someone knew. Someone had written to him, and they knew exactly where he slept. "Harry Potter, you give me that letter this instant." Uncle Vernon had gone purple in the face, a sure sign that he was working himself up to one of his explosions. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like fear. Harry had never seen Uncle Vernon afraid of a letter before. "It has my name on it," Harry said quietly, and even as the words left his mouth, he was surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "It's addressed to me. You don't get letters. No one writes to you." The envelope felt warm in Harry's hands, as if it held something more than paper, as if it held possibilities. He looked up at Uncle Vernon's purple face, at Aunt Petunia who had emerged from the kitchen with her mouth hanging open in horror, and made a decision that would change everything. "I think I'll read it," he said. Uncle Vernon lunged forward, but Harry was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time, with the letter pressed against his chest. He heard Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps pounding after him, heard Aunt Petunia's sharp intake of breath, but he didn't stop until he was in his bedroom with the door slammed and locked behind him. His hands were shaking as he broke the wax seal, a coat of arms featuring a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake surrounding a large letter H. The parchment inside crackled as he unfolded it. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by no later than July 31st. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Deputy Headmistress Harry read the letter 3 times. Then he read it again. The words didn't change. Witchcraft and wizardry. Magic. Real magic. Not the silly tricks that magicians did on television, but something that apparently required a school and textbooks and equipment. A second sheet of parchment had fallen to the floor. Harry picked it up and found a list of supplies. Cauldrons, scales, robes, a wand. A wand. He sat down hard on his bed, the letter still in his hands, and tried to make sense of what he was reading. Outside his door, Uncle Vernon was pounding and shouting, demanding that Harry open up this instant, threatening punishments that ranged from no meals for a week to being locked in his cupboard until Christmas. But the threats seemed distant now, muffled by the ringing in Harry's ears. Magic was real. Magic was real, and someone thought he belonged in a school for it. He thought of all the strange things that had happened around him over the years. The time his hair had grown back overnight after Aunt Petunia had given him that dreadful haircut. The day he'd somehow gotten onto the school roof when Dudley's gang was chasing him. The glass that had vanished at the zoo last summer. Things the Dursleys had punished him for. Things they'd called freakishness. Magic. Your mother was a freak, Aunt Petunia had said once, during one of her rare moments of unguarded anger. Should have known you'd turn out the same. His mother had been a witch. That's what this letter meant, wasn't it? His parents hadn't died in a car crash at all. They'd been part of this world, this place where magic was real and normal and taught in schools. The Dursleys had lied to him. For 10 years, they had lied to him about who he was, about where he came from, about what had really happened to his parents. Harry looked at the letter again, at the careful script that spelled out his address with such specificity. The cupboard under the stairs. They knew how the Dursleys treated him. This Minerva McGonagall, this deputy headmistress of a school for wizards, knew that he slept in a cupboard like some unwanted thing. The pounding on his door had stopped. Uncle Vernon's voice had dropped to a low, urgent murmur. Harry could hear him whispering to Aunt Petunia in the hallway, their voices carrying the kind of hushed panic usually reserved for discussions of overdue bills or unexpected visits from the neighbours. They were afraid. The Dursleys, who had spent 10 years making his life as small and miserable as possible, were afraid of this letter. Harry stood up and walked to his window. The owl was back, perched on the fence post, watching the house with those enormous, intelligent eyes. It was waiting for something. An answer, perhaps. The letter had said they awaited his owl by no later than 31st July. His owl. As if he had owls at his disposal. As if he belonged to a world where sending messages by bird was the most natural thing in the world. But he didn't belong to that world, did he? He belonged here, in this house that had never felt like home, with people who treated his very existence as an inconvenience. He belonged to school uniforms that never fit, and teachers who looked through him as if he weren't there, and birthday parties to which he was never invited. Harry walked to his small desk, a rickety thing salvaged from the garage when the Dursleys had finally been shamed into giving him a proper bedroom, and pulled out a piece of paper. Not parchment like the letter, just ordinary notebook paper with lines and 3 holes for a binder. He picked up a pencil and stared at the blank page for a long moment. Then he wrote 3 words in his careful, precise handwriting. "No, thank you." He folded the paper once, twice, then walked back to the window and pushed it open. The owl cocked its head at him, and Harry held out the note. "I suppose this is for you," he said quietly. The owl hopped forward and extended its leg. Harry tied the paper to it with a bit of string from his desk drawer, his fingers surprisingly steady. The bird regarded him for one more moment, and Harry could have sworn he saw something like disappointment in its amber eyes. Then it spread its wings and took flight, disappearing into the grey morning sky with his answer clutched in its talons. Harry sat back down on his bed and looked at the Hogwarts letter one more time. The words hadn't changed. The invitation was still there, written in green ink on parchment that smelled of old libraries and possibilities. He had just refused it. From downstairs came the sound of the front door opening, followed by Uncle Vernon's voice, raised in artificial cheer. "Morning, Mrs. Figg. Lovely weather we're having." Harry folded the letter carefully and slipped it under his mattress. Whatever magic was real, whatever world his parents had come from, whatever truth the Dursleys had hidden from him, none of it mattered now. He had made his choice. He had said no to magic. The tawny owl arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry as the afternoon sun slanted through the diamond-paned windows of the headmaster's office, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Albus Dumbledore had been expecting its return. The acceptance letters always brought replies, after all, though they were typically brief confirmations rather than the lengthier expressions of excitement that occasionally arrived from Muggle-born families discovering magic for the first time. What he had not expected was the look of what could only be described as confusion in the owl's amber eyes as it perched on his desk and extended its leg. Dumbledore untied the small piece of notebook paper with gentle fingers, noting absently that it was not parchment, not the heavy stationery that most wizarding families kept for correspondence. The paper was lined, torn from what appeared to be a child's school notebook, and folded with the precise care of someone who had little in the way of possessions, and therefore treated each one with particular attention. He unfolded it. 3 words, written in careful pencil script. "No, thank you." For a long moment, Dumbledore simply stared at the paper. In his 109 years of life, in his decades as headmaster of Hogwarts, he had never once received a refusal. Students occasionally failed to appear for the start of term due to family circumstances or illness. But an outright refusal? An actual, deliberate declining of a place at Hogwarts? It was unprecedented. More than that, it was concerning. The boy in question was not just any student. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had somehow survived the killing curse and brought about the downfall of Lord Voldemort 10 years ago. The wizarding world's savior, living quietly in Little Whinging with his Muggle relatives, supposedly safe and well cared for, until the day he would take his rightful place in the magical world. And he had just refused that place. Dumbledore set the paper down on his desk and removed his half-moon spectacles, cleaning them with slow, deliberate movements that gave him time to think. The owl watched him with intelligent eyes, as if waiting for a response it could carry back, but Dumbledore had no immediate answer to give. He rose from his chair and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the Hogwarts grounds. The castle was quiet in the summer months, with only a skeleton staff remaining to maintain the building and grounds in preparation for the new school year. Professor McGonagall would be in her office, reviewing the upcoming first-year class and preparing her lesson plans. Professor Snape would be brewing potions for the hospital wing in his dungeon laboratory. The other teachers were scattered across Britain, enjoying their summer holidays. But this situation required immediate attention. Minerva, he murmured to the empty office, and then, more firmly, he called her name through the castle's communication system, a subtle magic that allowed the senior staff to contact each other when needed. She arrived within minutes, her footsteps sharp and purposeful in the corridor outside. Professor McGonagall had always been prompt, but there was something in her bearing as she entered the office that suggested she had sensed the urgency in his call. "Albus," she said, taking in his expression, the paper on his desk, the waiting owl. "Has something happened?" Dumbledore gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit. We have received an unusual communication." McGonagall settled herself in the chair with the precise grace she brought to everything, her black robes arranging themselves neatly around her. At 55, she remained formidable, her dark hair pulled back in its customary severe bun, her square spectacles reflecting the afternoon light as she turned her attention to the paper he held out to her. She read it. Her eyebrows, already drawn together in concentration, rose slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "Harry Potter," Dumbledore said quietly, "has declined his place at Hogwarts." McGonagall stared at the paper for another moment, then looked up at him with an expression that combined shock, bewilderment, and the beginning of what he recognized as anger. "He's refused. But that's—" She paused, clearly struggling to find words for something so far outside the realm of normal experience. "Albus, no child refuses Hogwarts, especially not Harry Potter," Dumbledore finished. "Indeed." McGonagall set the paper down on the desk between them and leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. What reason could he possibly have? Surely the Dursleys haven't convinced him that magic isn't real. The boy has undoubtedly experienced accidental magic by now. Dumbledore considered this. Harry would turn 11 in a week's time, and magical children typically began showing signs of their abilities years before that. There would have been incidents, unexplained events that even the most determined Muggle relatives would have difficulty dismissing. The Dursleys, he said slowly, have never been enthusiastic about their connection to the magical world. Something shifted in McGonagall's expression, a tightening around her eyes that he recognized as the look she wore when trying to control her temper. "Yes," she said, her voice carefully level. "I recall expressing some concern about that very issue 10 years ago. The rebuke was gentle, but unmistakable. Dumbledore remembered that conversation well, McGonagall standing in the November cold outside number 4, Privet Drive, her voice sharp with disapproval as she watched the Dursleys through their windows and catalogued their character with the precision she brought to everything. "You said they were the worst sort of Muggles," he said quietly. "I said they were horrible," McGonagall corrected. "I said that boy was better off, famous in our world, than growing up with people who would never understand him, never appreciate what he'd done. I said." She stopped herself, drew a breath, and continued more calmly. "I said many things, and you chose not to listen." The weight of that decade-old decision settled between them in the quiet office. Dumbledore had believed then that Harry would be safer with blood relatives, protected by the ancient magic of his mother's sacrifice. He had believed that growing up away from fame and celebrity would be better for the boy's character. He had believed that the Dursleys, however unpleasant, would provide the basic care and stability a child needed. Looking at the 3-word refusal on his desk, he wondered if those beliefs had been catastrophically wrong. "Tell me," McGonagall said, her voice softer now. "When was the last time you checked on him? Actually checked? Not simply relied on reports from a distance?" Dumbledore felt the question like a physical blow. When had he last seen Harry Potter? When had he last verified that the boy was well, happy, thriving in the Muggle world? He received occasional reports from Mrs. Figg, the squib who lived nearby and kept a distant watch, but even those had been vague, limited to assurances that Harry was alive and unharmed. It had not seemed necessary to interfere. The blood protection was strong, while Harry lived with Petunia Dursley. The boy was safe from Voldemort's remaining followers. What more had been required? "I see," McGonagall said, reading his silence correctly. "So we know nothing of his actual circumstances. We know nothing of how he's been treated, what he's been told about his parents, about magic, about his place in our world. And now he's refused us entirely, and we're sitting here wondering why." The owl still perched on the desk, ruffled its feathers, and fixed one bright eye on Dumbledore, as if echoing McGonagall's assessment. Dumbledore picked up the paper again, studying the careful script. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the letters evenly spaced and properly formed. It was the handwriting of a child who had been taught precision, who had learned to take care with small things. But there was something else in those 3 words, something in the formal politeness of the refusal that made his chest tighten. "He thanked us," he said quietly. "I beg your pardon?" "No, thank you," Dumbledore repeated. "Not simply no. Not an angry refusal or a frightened rejection. He thanked us for the invitation and politely declined, like a child who has been taught proper manners but has no genuine warmth behind them." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the paper. When she spoke again, her voice was very soft. "Albus, what if he's not refusing magic? What if he's refusing us?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Dumbledore was not certain he was prepared to confront. The boy who lived, the child whose survival had ended the war and brought peace to the wizarding world, might want nothing to do with the very people he had saved. "We need more information," McGonagall said finally, her voice returning to its normal, brisk efficiency. "We need to understand what's happened to him in that house, what he's been told, how he's been treated. And we need to understand why a 10-year-old child who has just learned that magic is real would choose to turn away from it." Dumbledore nodded slowly. She was right, of course. They had acted on assumptions and distant monitoring for too long. If Harry Potter was in distress, if his circumstances were worse than they had imagined, if the Dursleys had damaged the boy in ways that went beyond simple neglect. "I should visit him," he said. "We should visit him," McGonagall corrected firmly. "And soon. If we're going to salvage this situation, we need to act quickly." The owl, as if sensing that the conversation had reached a conclusion, spread its wings and lifted off from the desk. It circled the office once before settling on the perch near the window, apparently content to wait for whatever response they would eventually send. Dumbledore looked at the paper one more time, at those 3 polite words that represented the first real crack in the careful plans he had made for Harry Potter's future. The boy had taken control of his own story in the most fundamental way possible, by saying no to the life that had been chosen for him. The question now was whether they could convince him to say yes. Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge had always prided himself on maintaining the smooth operation of magical Britain. Since taking office the previous year, he had worked tirelessly to preserve the peace and stability that had defined the wizarding world since the fall of you-know-who. The Dark Lord's defeat in 1981 had ushered in an era of unprecedented calm, and Fudge intended to keep it that way, which was why the memorandum that landed on his desk at 9:30 on Friday morning filled him with such immediate and profound unease. The parchment bore the official seal of the Owl Post Monitoring Office, a small but crucial department within the ministry's Communication Oversight Division. While they did not read every piece of mail that passed through the wizarding postal system, such surveillance would have been both impractical and politically unpalatable, they did maintain certain protocols for monitoring correspondence related to matters of public interest. The boy who lived certainly qualified as a matter of public interest. Fudge read the brief report twice, his round face growing more flushed with each reading. According to the monitoring office, an owl had been tracked flying from Little Whinging, Surrey, to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry the previous afternoon, carrying what appeared to be a response to the standard Hogwarts acceptance letter. The return journey had been noted and logged as routine. What was not routine was the follow-up communication that had been intercepted that same evening. An urgent message from Deputy Headmistress McGonagall to the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, requesting immediate consultation regarding unprecedented circumstances requiring ministerial awareness. Fudge set the memorandum down and reached for his quill, then thought better of it and walked to his office window instead. 10 floors below, the atrium bustled with the usual morning traffic, wizards and witches hurrying to lifts, interdepartmental memos zipping overhead like paper airplanes, the steady stream of visitors checking in at the security desk, all of it normal, all of it peaceful, all of it exactly as it should be in a well-ordered magical society. Harry Potter's refusal to attend Hogwarts was decidedly not normal. Fudge had built his political career on avoiding complications, and this had the potential to be the most significant complication he had faced since taking office. The boy who lived was not merely another student. He was a symbol, a living reminder of the wizarding world's greatest victory. His story was woven into the very fabric of magical society's recent history. Children grew up hearing tales of how baby Harry had somehow survived the killing curse and brought about the downfall of the most dangerous dark wizard in centuries. If that same Harry Potter was now refusing his place at Hogwarts, if he wanted nothing to do with the magical world that revered him, the implications were staggering. Fudge returned to his desk and activated the communication crystal that connected his office to his senior staff. Within minutes, his outer office was filled with the low murmur of arriving officials. He had called for an immediate consultation with the heads of the key departments: magical law enforcement, the improper use of magic office, magical accidents and catastrophes, and the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. "Send them in," he called to his secretary, and moments later his office was filled with the subdued tension of crisis management. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was the first to speak. A stern woman with a reputation for directness, she had reviewed the preliminary reports during the brief walk from her office to the ministers. "The situation is unprecedented," she said without preamble. "In the recorded history of Hogwarts School, no student has ever formally refused admission. The protocols simply don't exist." "What about the boys' guardians?" asked Cornelius Crouch, who oversaw the Department of International Magical Cooperation, but had been included due to his expertise in magical law. Surely the muggles he lives with have some influence over this decision. Fudge had been hoping someone else would raise this point. "According to our records, Harry Potter lives with his maternal aunt and her family. Muggles, as you noted. The placement was arranged by Albus Dumbledore immediately following the deaths of the boy's parents." "Dumbledore," muttered Bartemius Bode from Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. "Has anyone spoken to him about this?" "The preliminary report suggests that Hogwarts staff are treating this as an internal matter for now," Amelia Bones replied. "But if Potter has genuinely refused admission, it becomes a broader concern. The boy is not just any wizard. His status in our society makes this a potential crisis of public confidence." The words hung in the air like a curse. Fudge could see the same thought reflected in every face around his desk. If Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the savior of the wizarding world, wanted nothing to do with that world, what did that say about the world itself? "There's another concern," said Madam Hopkirk, from the improper use of magic office, her voice careful and measured. "Potter turns 11 in 6 days. The moment he reaches his majority, he falls under the jurisdiction of the Trace. If he's refusing magical education and has been raised entirely by muggles, he may not understand the restrictions on underage magic use." "You're suggesting he might violate the statute of secrecy?" Fudge's voice rose slightly. "I'm suggesting that a child who doesn't know the rules might break them," Hopkirk replied, "and given who this child is, any violation would attract immediate attention from both the magical and muggle press." The nightmare scenario was taking shape in Fudge's mind with crystalline clarity. Harry Potter, living in the muggle world, accidentally performing magic in front of witnesses. The exposure of the wizarding world, the collapse of the international statute of secrecy, headlines in both the Daily Prophet and muggle newspapers, parliamentary inquiries, his own career destroyed. "We need more information," he said finally. "I want a full assessment of Potter's current circumstances, who he's living with, how he's been treated, what he understands about his heritage and our world. I want to know why he refused Hogwarts, and what it would take to change his mind." "And if he maintains his refusal?" Crouch asked. Fudge was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. A Harry Potter who lived as a muggle, who rejected his place in magical society, who represented the very real possibility that someone could choose to leave the wizarding world behind entirely. It was a precedent that could not be allowed to stand. "Then we find a way to convince him otherwise," he said. "The boy who lived belongs to the magical world, whether he realizes it or not. Our society has invested too much in his story to allow him to simply walk away from it." Amelia Bones looked uncomfortable. "Minister, with respect, we cannot force a child to attend school against his will, even given the unusual circumstances." "We're not forcing anything," Fudge interrupted. "We're ensuring that he makes an informed decision. If Potter has been raised by muggles who don't understand or appreciate magic, if he's been given incomplete or incorrect information about his heritage, then it's our responsibility to correct that. We owe it to him, and we owe it to the thousands of witches and wizards who see him as a symbol of hope." The officials exchanged glances. Fudge could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the political implications, the potential for career advancement or destruction, the simple bureaucratic desire to have someone else handle a difficult problem. "I'm assigning Arthur Weasley from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office to conduct the initial investigation," Fudge announced. "He has experience dealing with Muggle-Wizard interactions and a reputation for discretion. Have him prepare a full report on Potter's living situation within the week." As the meeting broke up and his officials filed out with their new assignments, Fudge remained at his desk, staring at the memorandum that had started this crisis. 3 words, according to McGonagall's message. Harry Potter had refused his place at Hogwarts with just 3 words. No thank you. Polite, proper, and absolutely devastating in its implications. Fudge reached for his quill and began drafting a letter to Dumbledore. Whatever was happening in Little Whinging, whatever had convinced the boy who lived to turn his back on the magical world, it was going to be resolved quickly and quietly. His administration had enjoyed a year of peace and stability, and he had no intention of letting a 10-year-old boy, even this particular 10-year-old boy, disrupt that. The wizarding world needed Harry Potter, and Minister Fudge was going to make certain that Harry Potter needed the wizarding world in return. Arthur Weasley had never particularly enjoyed bringing work home with him. His position in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office typically involved cataloguing confiscated items and investigating reports of bewitched household objects. Interesting work, certainly, but hardly the sort of thing that required evening discussions with his family. Tonight, however, was different. The official memorandum from the minister's office crinkled in his jacket pocket as he walked up the winding path to the burrow. The summer evening was warm and still, filled with the buzz of insects and the distant sound of his wife's voice calling the children in for dinner. Through the kitchen window, he could see the familiar chaos of the Weasley household settling into its evening routine. Arthur paused at his front door, one hand on the brass knocker, and tried to organize his thoughts. How did one explain to his family that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, had refused his place at Hogwarts? How did one convey the political implications, the ministry's concern, the unprecedented nature of what had happened? And how did one prepare to visit a house full of muggles who, according to preliminary reports, had spent 10 years trying to pretend that magic didn't exist? The door opened before he could knock. "Dad!" Ginny's face appeared in the doorway, her red hair catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. At 9 years old, she was still small enough to look up at him with unguarded excitement. "Mum says dinner's ready. Fred put a dung bomb in Percy's trunk, and Percy's been shouting about it for an hour, and Ron found a spider in his room and won't come downstairs until someone gets rid of it." "A perfectly normal Thursday evening, then," Arthur said, managing a smile as he followed his daughter into the house. The burrow embraced him with its familiar warmth, the smell of his wife's cooking, the sound of animated voices from the kitchen, the comfortable chaos that came with raising 5 children in a house that seemed to have been built with more enthusiasm than architectural precision. Percy's indignant voice carried down from upstairs, punctuated by the muffled laughter of the twins. "Arthur?" Molly appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed from cooking, a wooden spoon still in her hand. "You're later than usual. Everything all right at the ministry?" Arthur hesitated. Everything was decidedly not all right at the ministry, but the explanation would have to wait until after dinner, when the children were occupied and he could speak to Molly properly. For now, he simply kissed his wife's cheek and allowed himself to be drawn into the gentle chaos of family dinner. The meal proceeded with its usual mixture of conversation, arguments, and barely controlled mayhem. Percy complained at length about the dung bomb incident, while Fred and George maintained expressions of perfect innocence. Ron, having apparently overcome his spider crisis, dominated the conversation with excited speculation about the upcoming Quidditch season. Ginny listened to everything with the intent absorption of the youngest child, occasionally asking questions that revealed she understood far more about her brother's various schemes than anyone gave her credit for. Arthur found himself watching his children with unusual attention. Ron, 11 years old, and burning with anticipation for his first year at Hogwarts. Percy, already deep into his Hogwarts career and taking every aspect of it with painful seriousness. The twins, whose magical education seemed to focus primarily on creative mayhem. And Ginny, still 2 years away from her Hogwarts letter, but already planning which house she would join and which subjects she would study. All of them took magic for granted. All of them saw Hogwarts as the natural, inevitable next step in their lives. None of them could conceive of a world where a wizard child might choose to turn away from that world entirely. After dinner, after the children had dispersed to their various evening activities, and the kitchen had been restored to some semblance of order, Arthur finally pulled the memorandum from his pocket. "Molly," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you about something." She looked up from the dishes she was charming to wash themselves, her expression shifting immediately to concern. "What's happened?" Arthur unfolded the official parchment and read aloud the formal language that had dominated his thoughts all afternoon. By order of the Minister for Magic, Arthur Weasley of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office is hereby assigned to conduct an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding Harry Potter, residing at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, with particular attention to his current living situation and recent refusal of admission to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Molly's mouth fell open. Harry Potter refused Hogwarts? 3 days ago. Sent back a note saying, "No thank you," and apparently means it. But that's... Molly groped for words, her hands stilling on the tea towel. Arthur, that's impossible. No child refuses Hogwarts, especially not Harry Potter. Arthur sat down heavily at the kitchen table. That's what Minister Fudge said, and Amelia Bones, and everyone else in the meeting this afternoon, which is why I've been assigned to find out what's going wrong. What do you mean, what's going wrong? The boy has been living with Muggles since he was a baby, his aunt and her family. Dumbledore placed him there after his parents were killed. Arthur rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. The Ministry is concerned that if Harry Potter has been mishandled by his Muggle relatives, it could reflect very poorly on the wizarding world's treatment of its most famous hero. Molly sank into the chair across from him. Mishandled how? Nobody knows. That's what I'm supposed to find out. Arthur looked at the memorandum again, noting the careful phrasing that suggested several different possibilities without explicitly stating any of them. I'm to approach the family, assess Potter's living conditions, and determine what has convinced him to refuse his place in our world. And if the Dursleys have been unkind to him? Arthur had been wondering the same thing. The possibilities ranged from simple neglect to active hostility, and none of them reflected well on the decision to place Harry with Muggle relatives in the first place. Then I report back to the Ministry and let them decide what to do about it. They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the implications. Harry Potter was not simply another child. He was a symbol, a story that every magical family told their children, a reminder that even the darkest times could end in hope. If that symbol was damaged, if the boy who lived had been broken by the very people entrusted with his care, "Dad!" Ron's voice carried down from upstairs, urgent and excited. Arthur heard his footsteps pounding down the stairs, 2 at a time, followed closely by the heavier tread of Percy and the synchronized footfalls of the twins. "Dad, is it true?" Ron burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with excitement and disbelief. "Percy heard you and Mum talking about Harry Potter. Is he really not coming to Hogwarts?" Arthur exchanged a quick glance with Molly. There was no point in trying to keep the information secret. The story would be all over the Ministry by tomorrow, and probably in the Daily Prophet by the end of the week. "It appears that Mr. Potter has declined his invitation to attend Hogwarts," he said carefully. "But why?" Percy pushed forward, his expression scandalized. "Doesn't he understand what an honor it is? Doesn't he know that every wizard in Britain would give anything to attend Hogwarts?" Fred and George, for once, looked genuinely stunned rather than amused. "Blimey," said Fred. "Harry Potter doesn't want to be a wizard?" added George. "Maybe he doesn't know he's a wizard," Ron said, his voice filled with the horror of someone who could not imagine such ignorance. "Maybe the Muggles he lives with never told him about magic." Arthur considered this possibility. It would certainly explain a refusal, though it raised other troubling questions about the boy's upbringing. "That's one of the things I'm supposed to find out." "You're going to see him?" Ron's eyes lit up. "You're going to meet Harry Potter. I'm going to visit his family and try to understand the situation." Ron looked as if he wanted to volunteer for the mission himself. At 11 years old, he was exactly Harry Potter's age, and Arthur knew that his youngest son had grown up on stories of the boy who lived just like every other magical child. The idea that Harry Potter might not want to be part of the wizarding world was clearly as incomprehensible to Ron as it had been to Minister Fudge. "When are you going?" Molly asked. "Tomorrow afternoon. I want to observe them during a normal day. See how they interact when they think no one is watching." Percy adjusted his glasses. What if the Muggles have been mistreating him? What if they've been hurting him? The question hung in the air, voicing the fear that Arthur had been trying not to examine too closely. If Harry Potter had been abused by the Muggles entrusted with his care, if the wizarding world's greatest hero had been broken by the very people who should have protected him, then we'll deal with that when we know for certain, Arthur said quietly. For now, we just need to understand what's happened and why. As his children eventually drifted back to their evening activities, Arthur remained at the kitchen table with the memorandum spread before him. Tomorrow he would drive to Little Whinging, Surrey, and knock on the door of a house where magic was unwelcome. He would try to speak to Muggles who had spent 10 years avoiding any contact with the wizarding world. He would attempt to understand why the most famous wizard child in Britain wanted nothing to do with the world that revered him. And somewhere in that house, probably unaware that his refusal had caused a crisis in the Ministry of Magic, Harry Potter was living the life he had chosen over Hogwarts. Arthur hoped, for everyone's sake, that it was a choice freely made, and not a decision born of circumstances too terrible to imagine. Arthur Weasley had visited many Muggle neighbourhoods in his years with the Ministry, but Privet Drive in Little Whinging struck him as particularly determined in its pursuit of absolute normalcy. The houses stood in perfect rows like soldiers on parade, each lawn trimmed to regulation height, each driveway swept clean of any debris that might suggest the inhabitants were anything less than model citizens. Number 4 was indistinguishable from its neighbours, except for the small brass numbers mounted beside the front door with military precision. Arthur parked his ministry car, carefully disguised to look like a perfectly ordinary Ford Anglia, several houses down, and walked slowly along the pavement, noting the lace curtains that twitched as residents observed his approach. In a neighbourhood like this, a stranger would be noticed, catalogued, and discussed over tea within the hour. He had spent the morning reviewing his strategy. Direct confrontation was unlikely to yield useful information. The Dursleys would simply close ranks and deny any problems. Instead, he would present himself as a concerned representative of Harry's school, checking on the boy's welfare following his unusual decision. It was close enough to the truth to be convincing. The doorbell of number 4 produced a melodious chime that echoed through the house. Arthur could hear movement inside, heavy footsteps, a sharp exchange of whispered words, the sound of someone being shoved into another room. When the door finally opened, Arthur found himself facing a man whose resemblance to a particularly aggressive walrus was quite remarkable. Vernon Dursley was exactly as large as the preliminary reports had suggested, but Arthur hadn't been prepared for the immediate hostility that radiated from the man like heat from a furnace. Vernon's small eyes darted past Arthur to scan the street, checking for additional threats, before settling on Arthur with undisguised suspicion. "Whatever you're selling, we're not interested," Vernon said, already beginning to close the door. "Actually, Mr. Dursley, I'm here about Harry." Arthur placed a gentle but firm hand on the door. "I'm from his school. There are some concerns about his recent decision, and we'd like to understand the situation better." Vernon's face began its transformation from normal pink to alarming purple. "His school! That bloody—" He caught himself, glanced again at the street, and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "You people have no right to come here. We've told you we want nothing to do with your kind." "I understand your position," Arthur said carefully. "But Harry is still a minor, and his welfare is our responsibility. Perhaps we could speak inside." For a moment, Arthur thought Vernon might slam the door in his face, but the man's eyes flicked once more to the watching windows of the neighbouring houses, and Arthur realised that Vernon Dursley's terror of exposure to the magical world was matched only by his fear of appearing abnormal to his Muggle neighbours. 5 minutes, Vernon hissed, stepping back to allow Arthur inside. And if any of the neighbours ask, you're from the gas company. The interior of number 4 was as aggressively normal as its exterior. Everything was clean, modern, and carefully arranged to project an image of suburban prosperity. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing Vernon, a thin blonde woman who must be Petunia, and a large blonde boy who was clearly their son. Arthur noted that none of the photographs included Harry. "Petunia!" Vernon bellowed toward the kitchen. "Come here. We have a visitor." The woman who appeared in the doorway was all sharp angles and barely contained nervousness. Petunia Dursley clutched a dish towel in her hands and kept glancing toward the stairs as if expecting an invasion at any moment. "He's from the boys' school," Vernon said, the words dripping with distaste. "Wants to discuss Harry's decision." Arthur had met many different types of Muggles in his career, from the genuinely curious to the actively hostile, but he had never encountered anything quite like the combination of fear and resentment that emanated from the Dursleys. They looked at him as if he were a particularly dangerous wild animal that had wandered into their pristine home. "Where is Harry?" Arthur asked gently. "I'd like to speak with him." "He's upstairs," Petunia said, her voice sharp with anxiety. "In his room, where he belongs." Arthur heard something in her tone that made him look more carefully at his surroundings. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed only 3 family members. The dining room table was set for 3. The shoes lined up by the door came in 3 sizes. Everything about the house suggested a family of 3, not 4. "Could you call him down, please? I'd like to understand his perspective on recent events." Vernon and Petunia exchanged a look that spoke volumes. It was the look of people who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong, but had convinced themselves was justified. "Boy!" Vernon shouted toward the ceiling. "Get down here, now!" The footsteps that came down the stairs were light and hesitant. When Harry Potter appeared in the living room, Arthur had to consciously control his expression to hide his shock. The famous lightning bolt scar was certainly there, just as the stories described. But everything else about the boy was wrong. Harry was far too small for his age, thin in a way that suggested inadequate nutrition rather than natural build. His clothes, a grey t-shirt and jeans, hung on him like empty sacks, obviously hand-me-downs from a much larger child. His black hair was uncut and unkempt, and when he looked up at Arthur through wire-rimmed glasses held together with tape, his green eyes held a wariness that no 10-year-old should possess. "Harry," Arthur said softly, crouching down to bring himself to the boy's eye level. "My name is Arthur Weasley. I work for the school that sent you a letter last week. I wanted to talk to you about your decision not to attend." Harry's eyes flicked quickly to Vernon and Petunia before returning to Arthur. "I said no thank you. I thought that was clear enough." There was something heartbreaking about the careful politeness in the boy's voice. Harry Potter, the most famous wizard child in Britain, was speaking like a servant addressing his masters, terrified of giving offence. "It was very clear," Arthur said, "but it's also very unusual. Most children are excited about the opportunity to attend Hogwarts. Can you tell me why you chose differently?" Again, that quick glance toward the Dursleys. Arthur began to understand that every word Harry spoke was being monitored, every response calculated to avoid punishment. "I don't belong in that world," Harry said quietly. "I belong here, with my family." Arthur looked around the living room again, noting the absence of any trace of Harry's existence. No photographs, no personal belongings, no indication that a child lived in this house at all. "Have you been happy here, Harry? Do you feel that this is the right place for you?" "Of course he's been happy," Petunia interjected sharply. "We've given him everything he needs. A roof over his head, food, clothing. More than most children have." Arthur stood and turned to face her. "What about love? What about belonging? What about being treated as part of the family?" Vernon's face completed its journey to purple. "How dare you come into our home and suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Arthur said mildly. "I'm observing. And what I observe is a boy who has been made to feel unwelcome in the only home he's ever known." "We took him in when no one else would," Petunia said, her voice rising with defensive anger. "We've clothed him and fed him and put up with his freakishness for 10 years. We've done our duty." "Your duty," Arthur repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "Not your joy? Not your love? Your duty?" Harry had gone very still during this exchange, his small hands clenched at his sides. Arthur realized that the boy had probably never heard anyone speak up for him before, never seen anyone challenge the Dursleys' treatment of him. "Harry," Arthur said, turning back to the boy, "would you like to show me your room?" The suggestion caused immediate alarm. Vernon stepped forward, as if to block the stairs, while Petunia made a strangled sound of protest. But Arthur was already moving, and Harry, after a moment's hesitation, led the way upstairs. Harry's bedroom was a small, cramped space that Arthur realized had probably been intended as a storage cupboard. The ceiling sloped sharply, making it impossible to stand upright in most of the room. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, and a small desk that looked salvaged from refuse occupied the only other available space. There were no decorations, no personal belongings beyond a few obviously second-hand books, nothing that suggested this room belonged to anyone at all. "This is where you sleep?" Arthur asked, trying to keep the horror out of his voice. "It's better than the cupboard," Harry said quietly, then immediately looked as if he wished he hadn't spoken. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. The cupboard. The famous Harry Potter had been living in a cupboard under the stairs. The address on his Hogwarts letter suddenly made terrible sense. "Harry, listen to me very carefully," Arthur said, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed so he could look directly into the boy's eyes. "The world I come from, the world that letter invited you to join, it's not perfect, but it's a world where you would be welcomed, where you would be celebrated, where you would be loved for who you are, not tolerated as a burden." "But I don't know anything about that world," Harry said. "I don't know how to be a wizard. I don't know the rules. I wouldn't fit in." "Do you fit in here?" Harry was quiet for a long moment. "No, but at least here I know what's expected of me. I know how to stay out of trouble." Arthur heard the exhaustion in the boy's voice, the weariness that came from years of walking on eggshells, of making himself as small and invisible as possible to avoid punishment. Harry Potter had not refused Hogwarts because he didn't want magic. He had refused it because he had learned not to want anything at all. "What if I told you that staying out of trouble isn't the point of life?" Arthur asked gently. "What if I told you that you deserved to be happy, to be curious, to make mistakes and learn from them? What if I told you that there are people in the magical world who would consider it an honor to teach you, to help you, to be your friend?" For just a moment, Harry's carefully constructed defenses wavered. Arthur saw a flash of longing in those green eyes, a glimpse of the child Harry should have been allowed to be. Then Vernon's voice boomed up from downstairs. "Time's up! Get that freak away from the boy!" The moment was broken. Harry's expression shuttered closed, and he stepped back from Arthur, as if remembering that hope was dangerous. As Arthur walked back down the stairs, his mind was already composing the report he would have to write. Harry Potter was not being physically abused, but the emotional neglect was systematic and devastating. The boy had been taught that he was unwanted, that his very existence was a burden to be endured rather than a gift to be celebrated. He had learned to expect nothing and ask for nothing, and the idea that he might deserve better had been carefully erased from his imagination. The Dursleys saw Arthur to the door with obvious relief, Vernon muttering under his breath about freaks and unnatural nonsense, while Petunia watched from the kitchen doorway with unconcealed hostility. As Arthur walked back to his car, he found himself thinking about his own children, about the chaos and love and laughter that filled the burrow. He thought about Ron, so excited about starting Hogwarts that he talked about nothing else. He thought about Ginny, already planning her own magical education years before she would receive her letter. And he thought about Harry Potter, sitting alone in a room that was barely larger than a cupboard, convinced that he deserved nothing better. By the time Arthur reached the Ministry, his report was already written in his mind. Harry Potter's refusal of Hogwarts was not a rejection of the magical world. It was the inevitable result of 10 years of systematic emotional destruction at the hands of people who should have protected him. The boy didn't think he deserved magic. He had been taught that he deserved nothing at all. Something, Arthur decided, as he climbed the steps to the Ministry building, would have to be done about that. Harry had always found birthdays to be complicated affairs in the Dursley household. His own had typically passed unmarked, while Dudley's were elaborate celebrations that lasted for days and involved presents that could have fed a small family. But this year felt different, even before July 30th arrived, charged with an anticipation that had nothing to do with cake or presents. The man from the Ministry, Mr. Weasley, had left 3 days ago, but his visit had changed something fundamental in the house. Vernon and Petunia spoke in hushed whispers when they thought Harry couldn't hear, their voices carrying the tight edge of people under strain. They watched him constantly now, as if expecting him to spontaneously burst into flames or transform into something even more unnatural than he already was. On the morning of July 30th, Harry woke with the strangest sensation that something important was happening somewhere else. He couldn't explain the feeling. It was as if a door had opened somewhere in the distance, or a signal had been sent that he was meant to receive but couldn't quite interpret. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the slanted ceiling of his small room, and wondered if this was what it felt like when other people his age entered the magical world he had refused. Somewhere in Britain, another 10-year-old was turning 11. Somewhere, a child was waking up to birthday wishes and the promise of Hogwarts letters, soon to come. Harry tried to imagine what that might feel like, to be wanted, to be celebrated, to be seen as a gift rather than a burden. The feeling persisted throughout the day. During breakfast, while Dudley complained about his summer holiday homework and Vernon buried himself behind his newspaper, Harry found his attention drifting to the windows, as if he expected to see something significant happening outside. But Privet Drive remained stubbornly normal, all neat gardens and gleaming cars and the gentle hum of suburbia going about its business. It wasn't until that evening, as Harry sat at his desk, attempting to make sense of a math problem that seemed designed to frustrate him, that he realized what tomorrow would bring. July 31st, his 11th birthday, the day he should have been heading to Diagon Alley with a giant named Hagrid to collect his school supplies and learn about the magical world that had claimed him as its own. Instead, he would wake up in this room, in this house, with these people who had spent 10 years making it clear that his very existence was an inconvenience they endured rather than embraced. Harry set down his pencil and walked to his window. The street below was quiet in the summer evening, painted gold by the setting sun. Mrs. Figg was visible in her front garden, tending to her roses with the careful attention she brought to everything. She looked up as if sensing his presence and gave him a small wave. Harry waved back, wondering if she knew about magic, if she understood what tomorrow meant. As if summoned by his thoughts, an owl appeared on his windowsill. Harry's breath caught. He recognized this owl. It was the same tawny bird that had brought his Hogwarts letter a week ago, but instead of a thick envelope, it carried only a small piece of parchment tied to its leg with purple ribbon. With trembling fingers, Harry opened the window and untied the message. The owl regarded him with what seemed like disappointment before spreading its wings and disappearing into the twilight. The parchment was expensive, heavier than normal paper, and the writing was done in silver ink that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Mr. Potter, tomorrow marks your entry into the magical world, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. At 11 years of age, you become subject to the laws and protections that govern all young wizards. We had hoped to welcome you properly, but respect your decision to remain with your family. However, we feel obligated to inform you that certain changes will now take effect. Your magical signature will be monitored for your own protection and that of the Statute of Secrecy. Any accidental magic that occurs in your vicinity will be noted and, if necessary, addressed. The offer of education and community remains open, should you choose to reconsider. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated his consciousness. Magical signature. Monitored. They weren't going to leave him alone after all. His refusal hadn't ended his connection to their world. It had simply changed the nature of their attention. He was still holding the letter when he heard Vernon's heavy footsteps on the stairs. Harry quickly folded the parchment and slipped it under his mattress, but he wasn't fast enough to hide his agitation. "What's wrong with you, boy?" Vernon demanded from the doorway. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing, Uncle Vernon, just tired." Vernon's small eyes narrowed. "If any more of your lot come sniffing around here, there'll be consequences. We've done our part, kept you fed and housed like we promised. But we won't have our lives disrupted by freaks and weirdos who can't take no for an answer." After Vernon left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, Harry retrieved the letter and read it again. Tomorrow marks your entry into the magical world, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The words felt like a trap closing around him. He had thought that saying no would be the end of it, that he could simply return to his life of careful invisibility and occasional small kindnesses from Mrs. Figg. Instead, tomorrow he would become something he didn't understand, subject to laws he had never learned, watched by people he had never met. Harry went to bed that night with the letter tucked under his pillow, but sleep eluded him. Every sound seemed magnified. The settling of the house, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of wind through the trees. Several times he thought he heard owl wings outside his window, and once he was certain he saw a shadow move across the garden that was too large and too purposeful to be a cat. They were watching him already. July 31st dawned grey and drizzly, as if the weather itself was acknowledging that this birthday would be unlike any other. Harry lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the household beginning its day. Uncle Vernon's alarm clock, the shower running, Aunt Petunia's sharp voice calling Dudley to breakfast. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, sounds that belonged to a world where magic didn't exist, and 11-year-old boys weren't expected to understand mysteries that adults spent years learning. But when Harry finally forced himself to get dressed and go downstairs, He could feel the difference immediately. It was subtle, like the change in air pressure before a storm, but unmistakable. Something about him had shifted overnight. Some invisible line had been crossed. The Dursleys felt it too. Vernon looked up from his newspaper when Harry entered the kitchen, his face already beginning its familiar transformation toward purple. Petunia's hands shook slightly as she poured tea, and Dudley, who usually ignored Harry completely, kept shooting nervous glances in his direction. "It's your birthday," Aunt Petunia said finally, the words escaping as if under pressure. "Yes." 11 years old. She said it like she was pronouncing a death sentence. Harry helped himself to a piece of toast, noting that his hands were steadier than anyone else's at the table. Whatever was happening to him, whatever this magical signature business meant, it wasn't something he could feel. He was still himself, still the unwanted nephew who lived in the smallest bedroom and wore Dudley's cast-off clothes. But the fear radiating from the Dursleys suggested that something fundamental had changed. The morning passed quietly until nearly 11 o'clock, when a knock at the front door sent Vernon into such a state of panic that he actually dropped his teacup. "It's them," Petunia whispered, her face draining of colour. "They've come for him." But when Vernon finally worked up the courage to answer the door, it was only the postman with a package for next door that had been misdelivered. The relief in the house was palpable, but it lasted only until Harry realized what the interruption meant. 11 o'clock. If his life had followed the path laid out for him, this would have been the moment when Hagrid arrived to collect him for Diagon Alley. Instead, he was sitting in the Dursleys' kitchen, watching his relatives recover from a panic attack brought on by the postman. The rest of the day stretched ahead of him, empty of celebration or acknowledgement, marked only by the growing tension that seemed to emanate from his very presence. Harry was 11 years old, officially subject to magical law, monitored by forces he couldn't see or understand, and he had never felt more alone. As evening approached, bringing with it the soft sounds of a neighborhood settling down for the night, Harry stood at his window and watched the street below. Mrs. Figg was in her garden again, and when she looked up and saw him, she raised her hand in a gesture that seemed both greeting and farewell. For just a moment, Harry thought he saw something else in her expression. Knowledge, perhaps, or sympathy, or the recognition that today had changed everything in ways that couldn't be undone. Then she turned away, and Harry was left with his reflection in the darkening window, 11 years old and caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Professor Minerva McGonagall had never made a house call to speak to a student's family about educational matters. In her 30 years at Hogwarts, such discussions had always taken place in her office or during official school visits. But then again, she had never had a student refuse admission entirely, and extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary measures. She stood outside number 4, Privet Drive, at precisely 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, having chosen the time carefully. The children would be inside during the heat of the day, the adults would be present, and the neighborhood would be quiet enough for a private conversation. McGonagall had dressed in her most conservative Muggle clothing, a dark blue suit and sensible shoes, but even so, she was aware that her bearing marked her as someone who did not belong in this aggressively ordinary suburb. The door was answered by a woman whose sharp features and suspicious expression immediately reminded McGonagall of someone constantly braced for disappointment. "Mrs. Dursley," McGonagall said without preamble, "I am Professor McGonagall from Hogwarts School. I believe you know why I'm here." Petunia Dursley's face went through several color changes before settling on a sickly white. "You can't, Vernon. Vernon!" The man who appeared behind his wife was exactly as Arthur Weasley had described, large, purple-faced and radiating hostility, like heat from a furnace. "We told your people we want nothing to do with this," Vernon said, his voice low and threatening. The boy made his decision. "Leave us alone." "I'm afraid I can't do that," McGonagall replied calmly. "Harry Potter is 11 years old. He cannot make an informed decision about his education when he has been given no information about what he's rejecting. I'm here to correct that deficiency." "He knows everything he needs to know," Petunia said quickly. McGonagall's eyebrows rose. "Does he? Does he know that his parents were murdered protecting him? Does he know that he survived an attack that should have killed him? Does he know that in our world he's considered a hero?" The Dursleys exchanged a look of pure panic. McGonagall had clearly struck closer to the truth than they were comfortable with. "May I come in?" she asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a question. The Dursley living room was as aggressively normal as Arthur's report had suggested, but McGonagall's attention was immediately drawn to the thin boy who sat hunched in a chair by the window. Harry Potter looked exactly like his father. The same untidy black hair, the same general build, but those green eyes were unmistakably Lily's, and they watched McGonagall with a wariness that broke her heart. "Harry," she said gently, settling herself in a chair across from him. "I'm Professor McGonagall. I've come to talk to you about Hogwarts." Harry's eyes flicked to the Dursleys before returning to her. "I already said no, thank you." "Yes, you did. But I don't think you understand what you said no to." "He understands perfectly," Vernon interrupted. "He's a normal boy who wants a normal life with his family. That's his right." McGonagall looked at Vernon with the expression she typically reserved for particularly stupid students. "Mr. Dursley, Harry Potter is many things, but normal is not one of them. He is a wizard. That is not something he can choose not to be. It's something he is, as fundamentally as he has green eyes or black hair. The only choice is whether he learns to control his abilities in a safe environment with qualified teachers, or whether he struggles with them alone." "He's controlled himself just fine for 11 years, Petunia said defensively. "Has he?" McGonagall turned back to Harry. "Have there been incidents? Times when things happened around you that you couldn't explain? Glass breaking, objects moving, your hair growing back overnight?" Harry's startled expression was answer enough. "Those incidents will become more frequent and more powerful as you grow older," McGonagall continued. "Without training, they could become dangerous, to you and to others. This isn't a request, Harry. It's a necessity." "We'll manage," Vernon said firmly. "We've managed so far." "By locking him in a cupboard under the stairs?" McGonagall's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. "By treating him like an unwanted burden rather than the child you agreed to raise?" The silence that followed was deafening. Harry had gone very still, his eyes fixed on his hands, and McGonagall realized that her words had confirmed fears he had been too afraid to voice. "The wizarding world isn't perfect, Harry," she said softly, "but it's a place where your abilities are normal, where your heritage is understood, where you would be welcomed and valued. More than that, it's where you belong." Harry looked up at her then, and McGonagall saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Hope, quickly suppressed, followed by the bone-deep conviction that he didn't deserve what she was offering. "I don't know how to be a wizard," Harry said quietly. "I don't know anything about that world. I'd just make a fool of myself." "Every child who enters Hogwarts knows nothing about our world," McGonagall replied. "That's what we're there to teach. You wouldn't be behind, Harry. You'd be exactly where you're supposed to be." But even as she spoke, McGonagall could see that her words weren't penetrating the shell of learned helplessness that surrounded the boy. 10 years of being told he was worthless, of being trained not to want anything, had built walls that logic and kindness couldn't easily breach. She left number 4 with a heavy heart and a growing sense that the problem was far more serious than anyone at Hogwarts had realized. Harry Potter didn't need convincing about the merits of magical education. He needed healing from a decade of systematic emotional abuse. The emergency staff meeting that evening was held in the small conference room adjacent to Dumbledore's office. McGonagall had called it immediately upon returning to Hogwarts, and the heads of houses had responded with the gravity the situation demanded. "The boy has been systematically broken," she said without preamble. "Not physically abused, as far as I can determine, but emotionally destroyed in ways that may be irreversible. He doesn't believe he deserves anything better than what he has." Professor Flitwick, perched on a stack of books to bring him level with the table, shook his head sadly. "A child's mind is remarkably resilient, Minerva. Perhaps with patience and the right approach—" "What approach?" McGonagall interrupted. "I offered him everything. Education, community, belonging, the truth about his heritage. He looked at me as if I were offering him something that belonged to someone else." Professor Sprout, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued, leaned forward. "Has anyone considered that perhaps forcing the issue might do more harm than good? If the child is as damaged as you suggest, perhaps a gentle approach over time." "There is no time," McGonagall said flatly. "Term starts in 3 weeks. If Harry Potter doesn't attend Hogwarts, the story will be impossible to contain. The wizarding world will want answers." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. "Perhaps," said Professor Snape from his position in the shadows near the door, "the wizarding world should be told the truth." All eyes turned to him. Snape rarely spoke during staff meetings, and when he did, it was usually to criticize someone's incompetence. This level of engagement was unusual. "Explain," McGonagall said curtly. Snape stepped into the light, his black robes billowing around him. "Potter, Harry Potter, is the son of Lily Evans. Lily, who died protecting him. And we are sitting here discussing strategies to manipulate a damaged child into accepting what we think is best for him, without considering what she would have wanted." "And what do you think she would have wanted?" Professor Sprout asked gently. Snape was quiet for a long moment, his black eyes fixed on something none of them could see. She would have wanted him to be safe. She would have wanted him to be loved. She would have wanted him to have choices. His voice hardened. She would not have wanted him to be another pawn in games he doesn't understand, played by people who see him as a symbol rather than a child. "So what are you suggesting?" McGonagall demanded. "I'm suggesting that perhaps the boy's refusal is the most sensible decision anyone has made in this entire debacle. Perhaps he should be allowed to walk away from a world that has already failed him so completely." The suggestion hung in the air like a curse. The idea that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the symbol of their victory over darkness, might be better off as a Muggle was almost heretical. But as the staff members looked around the table at each other, none of them could find an immediate argument against it. Meanwhile, in his small room at number 4, Privet Drive, Harry sat at his desk and stared at a piece of paper he had been trying to write on for the past hour. The ministry had sent him information about magical monitoring and his rights as an underage wizard. Hogwarts had sent him course catalogues and reading lists. Various officials had visited or written, each certain they knew what was best for his future. But no one had asked Harry what he wanted. No one, except the man in the mirror, whose question had been haunting him for days. "Do you fit in here?" The answer was no. But the answer to "would you fit in there?" was also no. Harry had learned not to fit anywhere, not to want anything, not to expect kindness or belonging or love. Those were things that happened to other people, people who deserved them. Harry set down his pencil and walked to his window. The street below was quiet in the evening light, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of children playing in a garden. Normal children, living normal lives, belonging to families that wanted them. Tomorrow would bring more letters, more visitors, more people trying to convince him to want things he had been taught were beyond his reach. But tonight, Harry Potter sat alone in his small room and tried to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to someone, to be wanted rather than merely tolerated. It was, he decided, too dangerous a thought to pursue. Andromeda Tonks had spent the better part of 20 years learning to live without her family. Being disowned by the noble and most ancient House of Black for marrying a Muggle-born wizard had been painful, but not unexpected. She had known the price of choosing love over blood purity when she walked away from the ancestral home at Grimmauld Place. But some connections ran deeper than disownment. Some obligations transcended the arbitrary boundaries of family approval, which was why the news her daughter brought home from the ministry on a sweltering Thursday evening in August felt like a summons she could not ignore. "The whole Aura department is talking about it," Nymphadora said, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table with the boneless sprawl that characterized 18-year-olds everywhere. Her hair, currently a sensible brown for her training program, was damp with perspiration from the heat. Harry Potter refused his Hogwarts letter. Can you believe it? The boy who lived doesn't want to be a wizard. Ted looked up from the evening edition of the Daily Prophet, his fair eyebrows raised. Refused? How does one refuse Hogwarts? Apparently by sending back a 3-word note, Nymphadora continued, accepting the glass of cold pumpkin juice her mother pressed into her hands. The senior Auras are saying it's caused a complete crisis. Fudge has assigned investigators. Dumbledore himself is involved, and still the boy won't budge. He's living with Muggle relatives who want nothing to do with magic. Andromeda felt something cold settle in her stomach. Which Muggle relatives? His mother's sister, I think. The Dursleys. They live in Surrey somewhere. Nymphadora shrugged, unaware of the significance of her words. From what I'm hearing, they're not exactly thrilled to have a wizard in the house. The whole situation sounds like a mess. Ted and Nymphadora continued their discussion, but Andromeda found herself remembering a conversation from 20 years ago, held in the drawing room of the Black family home. Sirius, barely 18, and already showing signs of the rebellion that would eventually see him disowned as well, had been talking about his best friend's wedding plans. "James wants me to be godfather," Sirius had said, his grey eyes bright with an excitement he rarely showed at family gatherings. "Can you imagine? Me responsible for a child?" "You'll be wonderful," Andromeda had replied, and she had meant it. For all his wildness, Sirius Black had possessed a fierce loyalty and an instinctive protectiveness toward those he loved. If something happened to James and Lily Potter, Sirius would move heaven and earth to ensure their child was safe and loved. But Sirius hadn't been there to protect Harry Potter. Sirius had been rotting in Azkaban for 10 years, convicted of betraying the very people he would have died to defend. "Mother?" Nymphadora's voice broke through her reverie. "You've gone awfully quiet. What's wrong?" Andromeda looked at her daughter. So young, so eager to make her mark in the world, so blissfully unaware of the darkness that had torn their family apart. "Tell me more about Harry Potter's situation. What exactly are the Ministry investigators finding?" "Well, from what I've overheard, it's pretty grim." Nymphadora's expression sobered. "Arthur Weasley did the initial assessment. You remember Mr. Weasley, don't you? He visited when I was at Hogwarts. Anyway, he reported back that the boy's been essentially emotionally neglected. not beaten or starved, but treated more like an unwanted burden than a family member. Lives in the smallest bedroom, wears hand-me-down clothes, no personal belongings to speak of. Ted made a sound of distress. That's horrible. The poor child. It gets worse, Nymphadora continued. Apparently Professor McGonagall went to see him personally, and the boy looked at her as if she were offering him something that belonged to someone else. He genuinely believes he doesn't deserve better than what he has. Andromeda felt her hands clench into fists. James Potter had been a good man, arrogant perhaps, but fundamentally decent, with a hero complex that had ultimately gotten him killed trying to protect his family. Lily Evans had been brilliant and kind, the sort of person who saw the best in everyone and fought fiercely for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Their son, Sirius's godson, was being systematically destroyed by people who should have loved him. There's something else, Nymphadora said quietly, as if sensing the dark turn her mother's thoughts had taken. Something the senior Aurors don't like to talk about in front of trainees like me. But I heard Mad-Eye Moody telling Kingsley Shacklebolt that the whole situation stinks. He thinks there's more to it than just a boy refusing school. What kind of more? Ted asked. He didn't say exactly, but he mentioned something about convenient arrangements and questions that should have been asked 10 years ago. And when Kingsley asked him what he meant, Mad-Eye just growled something about how Sirius Black never got a trial. The words hit Andromeda like a physical blow. She had wondered, over the years, how Sirius could have betrayed James and Lily. The Sirius she remembered would have torn his own heart out before harming someone he loved. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Peter Pettigrew dead, 12 Muggles killed, and Sirius standing in the wreckage laughing like a madman. Except now Mad-Eye Moody, the most paranoid and experienced Auror in the Ministry's history, was suggesting that perhaps the evidence hadn't been as clear as everyone assumed. Mother? Nymphadora was staring at her with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Andromeda forced herself to focus on her daughter's worried face. Dora, what do you know about the night James and Lily Potter were killed? Just the basic story everyone knows. You know who tracked them down, killed them, tried to kill baby Harry, but the curse rebounded. Sirius Black was the one who betrayed their location to you-know-who, and when Peter Pettigrew confronted him about it, Sirius killed him and 12 Muggles. Why? Because, Andromeda said slowly, the Sirius Black I knew would never have betrayed anyone. Certainly not James Potter, who was closer to him than any blood relation. And if Mad-Eye Moody thinks the case deserves another look. Ted leaned forward across the table. Andromeda, you can't seriously be thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking that Harry Potter is Sirius's godson, and that makes him family. I'm thinking that if Sirius is innocent, and everything I know about his character suggests he is, then that child is being failed, not just by his Muggle relatives, but by everyone who should have been protecting him. Andromeda stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. I'm thinking that James and Lily Potter died believing their son would be loved and protected, and instead he's being systematically broken by people who see him as nothing more than an unwanted obligation. But what can we do? Nymphadora asked. I mean, I'm just a trainee Auror, and you and Dad aren't exactly well connected politically. Andromeda looked at her daughter and husband, both of whom were watching her with the mixture of concern and respect that came from 20 years of marriage and parenthood. They had built a life together outside the traditional wizarding establishment, finding their own way through love and determination and hard work. They understood better than most what it meant to be unwanted by the world you were born into. What we can do, Andromeda said firmly, is exactly what the Ministry and Hogwarts have been unable to do. We can offer that boy what he actually needs, instead of what we think he should want." "Which is?" Ted asked. "A family. Not one that tolerates him out of duty or sees him as a symbol to be managed, but one that wants him for himself. One that understands what it means to be rejected by the world you're supposed to belong to and loved anyway." Nymphodora's eyes widened. "You want to contact Harry Potter directly." "I want to offer him something no one else has thought to offer him," Andromeda corrected. "A choice that doesn't involve choosing between two forms of rejection. The Dursleys clearly don't want him, but they're keeping him out of duty. The wizarding world wants him, but only as a symbol and a hero. We could offer him something else entirely." "And if Sirius really is innocent?" Ted asked quietly. Andromeda met her husband's eyes, seeing in them the same sense of moral certainty that had led him to choose love over social standing all those years ago. "Then I owe it to my cousin to protect the child he couldn't. I owe it to James and Lily to ensure their son knows he's wanted. And I owe it to that boy to show him what family actually means." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the soft tick of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of summer evening settling over their neighborhood. Andromeda could see her reflection in the window. Dark hair, aristocratic features, the unmistakable stamp of the Black family bloodline that she had never quite been able to escape. But perhaps, for once, that heritage could be useful for something other than intimidation and political maneuvering. Perhaps it could be used to save a child who had been failed by everyone who should have protected him. "When do we start?" Ted asked quietly. Andromeda smiled at her husband, feeling for the first time in weeks that she had found the right path forward. "Tomorrow. We start tomorrow." Harry had grown accustomed to the sight of unusual visitors at number 4, Privet Drive. First Mr. Weasley with his kind eyes and growing concern, then Professor McGonagall with her stern certainty that she knew what was best for him. Each visit had followed the same pattern: formal introductions, tense conversations with the Dursleys, attempts to convince him to reconsider his refusal of Hogwarts, and eventual departure with expressions of disappointment or frustration. So when the doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening in late August, Harry expected more of the same. What he didn't expect was to open the door and find a woman whose face made him think immediately of aristocracy and warmth in equal measure, standing beside a fair-haired man whose smile seemed to encompass the entire world. "Harry Potter," the woman said, and there was something in her voice that made him straighten slightly. Not the authority of Professor McGonagall or the official concern of Mr. Weasley, but something that sounded almost like recognition. "My name is Andromeda Tonks, and this is my husband, Ted. We've come to talk to you about family." Before Harry could respond, Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps announced his approach from the living room. The purple complexion that had become his permanent state since magical visitors started appearing intensified when he saw the couple on his doorstep. "Not more of you people," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We've told everyone. The boy made his decision. He's staying here where he belongs." "Actually," Andromeda said, with the kind of polite firmness that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed, "I don't think anyone has asked Harry what he actually wants. They've told him what's available, what's expected, what's required, but no one has simply asked him what would make him happy." Harry found himself staring at this woman, Andromeda, trying to understand what made her different from the other magical adults he'd met. She had the same aristocratic bearing as Professor McGonagall, but where McGonagall projected authority, Andromeda projected something that felt almost like affection, as if she were looking at someone she was genuinely pleased to see. "May we come in?" Ted asked, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that made Harry think of summer afternoons and kitchens filled with the smell of baking. "We have some things to tell Harry that he has a right to know." Vernon's face completed its transformation to purple, but Petunia appeared behind him, her sharp features pinched with curiosity and fear in equal measure. "What things?" she demanded. "Things about his godfather," Andromeda said quietly. "Things about family obligations that were never fulfilled because of a terrible injustice. Things about choices that have never been offered." The word godfather seemed to hit the Dursleys like a physical blow. Petunia made a strangled sound, and Vernon's hand moved instinctively to the door as if to slam it shut. But Harry stepped forward, his curiosity finally overcoming his learned caution. "I have a godfather?" he asked. Andromeda's expression softened in a way that made Harry's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. "You do. His name is Sirius Black, and he's my cousin. He was your father's best friend, and your parents chose him to be your guardian if anything ever happened to them." "Then why—" Harry began, but Vernon interrupted with a sound like an angry bull. "Because he's a murderer. He killed those people. He betrayed Harry's parents and went to prison for it." "No," Andromeda said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that made the word ring like a bell. "He didn't. Sirius Black is many things. Impulsive, reckless, fiercely loyal to the people he loves. But he is not a murderer, and he would have died before betraying James and Lily Potter." Harry felt the world shift slightly around him. But if he's innocent, why is he in prison? Ted stepped forward, his kind face creased with sadness. "Because sometimes the justice system fails, Harry. Sometimes people are so eager to blame someone, to close a case and move on, that they don't ask the right questions. Your godfather was convicted without a trial, based on circumstantial evidence, and the assumption that he must be guilty because he was found at the scene. We think," Andromeda added gently, "that Sirius was trying to track down the real traitor when he was arrested. But by the time anyone thought to question the official story, he was already in Azkaban, and it was easier to let sleeping dragons lie." Harry sank down onto the front step, his legs suddenly unsteady. A godfather. Someone who was supposed to care for him, who was chosen by his parents specifically for that purpose. Someone who might have wanted him, who might have loved him the way parents were supposed to love their children. Someone who had been locked away for 10 years for a crime he didn't commit while Harry lived in a cupboard under the stairs. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. Andromeda sat down beside him on the step, ignoring Vernon's indignant sputtering about proper behavior and inappropriate discussions on his front porch. "Because you have the right to know who you are and where you come from. Not the legend, not the boy who lived nonsense, but the truth about the people who loved you and the family you were meant to have." "But also," Ted added, settling himself on Harry's other side, "because we wanted you to know that you have choices, real choices, not just the ones other people think you should make." Harry looked between them, these two magical adults who had sought him out, not to lecture him about duty or destiny, but to tell him about family. "What kind of choices?" "Well," Andromeda said, her voice taking on a thoughtful quality, "you could continue living here with the Dursleys, if that's what makes you happy. Or you could attend Hogwarts, if you decide you want to learn about magic in a formal setting. But you could also do neither of those things. Neither. There are other schools," Ted explained. "Other ways to learn about magic. Other families who would be honored to help a young wizard find his place in the world. You don't have to choose between neglect and obligation, Harry. There are people who would simply be glad to know you. The concept was so foreign that Harry had trouble processing it. People who would want to know him just for himself? Not because he was famous, not because they felt obligated to care for him, but because they genuinely wanted his company. "You mean," he said carefully, "there are families who would want me? Even though I don't know anything about magic and I'm not good at anything, and I'd just be a burden?" The silence that followed his question was deafening. Harry looked up to find both Andromeda and Ted staring at him with expressions of such profound sadness that he immediately regretted speaking. He had said something wrong, revealed too much about how the Dursleys saw him. "Oh, Harry," Andromeda said softly, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Sweet boy, you wouldn't be a burden. You would be a gift." "But I don't know how to be part of a family," Harry protested. "I don't know the rules or how to act or what's expected. I'd just mess everything up." Ted reached over and gently took Harry's hand, and Harry was so surprised by the gesture that he forgot to pull away. "The only rule of family, Harry, is that you matter. Not because of what you can do or what you know or how useful you are, just because you exist, and because the people who love you think the world is better with you in it." Harry stared down at their joined hands, trying to understand what Ted was telling him. The idea that someone might value him simply for existing was so impossible that his mind kept rejecting it, looking for the catch, the condition, the price he would have to pay. "What would you want in return?" he asked finally. Andromeda laughed, but it wasn't the cruel laughter he was accustomed to from Dudley or his friends. It was warm and genuine, the sound someone might make when a child asked an unexpectedly charming question. "Nothing," she said. "We would want nothing in return except the pleasure of watching you figure out who you are when no one is telling you who you have to be." From the doorway, Vernon's voice rose to a near shout. "This is enough! You're filling the boy's head with nonsense. He belongs here, with his family, living a normal life." Andromeda stood gracefully and turned to face Vernon with an expression that made Harry think of winter storms and aristocratic displeasure. "Mr. Dursley," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of commanding respect. "With all due respect, you are not Harry's family. You are his relatives. There's a considerable difference." "We've raised him," Petunia interjected shrilly. "We've fed him and clothed him, and put a roof over his head for 10 years. "You've housed him," Ted corrected gently, rising to stand beside his wife. "But you haven't loved him, and Harry deserves to know what it feels like to be loved." Harry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, though he couldn't have said whether they came from sadness or relief or something else entirely. No one had ever spoken about him the way these people were speaking, as if he were something precious rather than problematic. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why would you care? You don't even know me." Andromeda knelt down in front of him, bringing herself to his eye level. "Harry, your father was one of the bravest, kindest men I ever knew. Your mother was brilliant and fierce and would have moved mountains to protect you. They loved you so much that they died for you. And my cousin Sirius would have raised you with the kind of love and laughter they wanted for you, if he hadn't been wrongfully taken away." She paused, her grey eyes, so like Sirius's, Harry realized, soft with emotion. We care because they can't. We care because someone should. And we care because when we look at you, we see a child who deserves every good thing the world has to offer, and we want to be part of making that happen. Harry looked up at these two people who had appeared on his doorstep, offering him something he had never dared to dream of, and for the first time since receiving his Hogwarts letter. He allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world where he could belong. Chapter 10. The conversation with the Tonks family stretched long into the evening, far past the time when Harry would normally have been sent to his room. Aunt Petunia had retreated to the kitchen after the formal introductions, her thin frame rigid with the kind of disapproval she typically reserved for anything that deviated from the rigid normalcy of Privet Drive. Uncle Vernon had excused himself to his study with muttered complaints about disrupting a decent household, but Harry suspected he was simply uncomfortable with the obvious affection between Ted and Andromeda Tonks. Harry found himself studying the couple with the careful attention he had learned to apply to adult behavior. Ted Tonks had the easy manner of someone genuinely comfortable with children, asking questions about Harry's interests without the probing intensity that had characterized his previous visitors. Andromeda possessed an elegant composure that reminded Harry of Professor McGonagall, but where the Hogwarts professor had projected stern authority, Mrs. Tonks radiated a warmth that seemed to include rather than evaluate him. "You don't have to decide tonight," Andromeda said gently, perhaps sensing the weight of Harry's internal deliberation. "This is a significant choice, and you should take whatever time you need to consider it properly. But," Ted added with a slight smile, "we want you to know that the offer is genuine. We're not here because of your fame, or your parents' legacy, or anything the wizarding world expects from you. We're here because we think you deserve better than this, and we'd like to be part of providing that for you." Harry looked down at his hands, still struggling with the concept that anyone would want him for who he was, rather than who they thought he should become. What would happen if I said yes? Would I have to go to Hogwarts? The question hung in the air for a moment before Andromeda answered carefully. That would be entirely your choice. Ted and I both attended Hogwarts and valued our education there, but we understand that your feelings about magical education are complicated. If you decided to live with us, we could explore other options. Private tutoring, perhaps, or waiting until you felt ready to make that decision for yourself. The important thing, Ted continued, is that you would be in a household where your magical heritage is understood and accepted, not hidden or denied. Even if you never chose to pursue formal magical education, you would grow up knowing who you are and where you came from. Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. The idea of living somewhere his magic was not a source of shame or fear was almost overwhelming in its appeal. But wars of disappointment had taught him to be cautious about hope. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "You don't know anything about me, except what you've read in books or heard from other people. What if I'm not? What if I'm not the kind of person you think I am?" Andromeda's expression grew fierce in a way that reminded Harry suddenly of the black family reputation he had read about in one of the books Mrs. Figg had shared. "Harry Potter," she said firmly, "you are a child who has been systematically taught that you are worthless by people who should have protected you. The fact that you can still ask that question, that you can still worry about disappointing people who want to care for you, tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are. Besides," Ted added with a gentle grin, "we've got some experience with children who don't fit conventional expectations. Our daughter Nymphadora would probably enjoy having someone else around who understands what it's like to feel different." Harry had heard that name before. Tonks, the metamorphmagus who worked as an aura. The thought of having an older sister figure, someone who had grown up magical and different, was oddly appealing. "What would the ministry say?" Harry asked. "All those officials who've been coming here seem very concerned about where I end up." Andromeda and Ted exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared understanding. "The ministry Andromeda said carefully. Would probably prefer that you were with wizarding guardians, rather than staying here. They've made it clear that your current living situation is concerning to them. As for the rest of it, Ted continued, well, the Black family name still carries considerable weight in certain circles, even if Andromeda was officially disowned. There are advantages to being connected to one of the sacred 28 families, regardless of our personal feelings about blood purity nonsense. Harry found himself considering the political implications with a sophistication that would have surprised the adults around him if they had known how carefully he had been listening to their conversations over the past weeks. The wizarding world wanted him to be their symbol, their boy who lived. Living with the Dursleys had clearly become untenable in their minds, but placing him with a respectable wizarding family would allow them to maintain the narrative they wanted while addressing the obvious problems with his current guardians. If I came with you, Harry said slowly, would you try to make me into someone I'm not? Would you want me to be the boy who lived, or could I just be Harry? Just Harry, Andromeda said, without hesitation. Always just Harry. The simplicity of that promise hit Harry with unexpected force. For the first time since receiving his Hogwarts letter, he allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve either rejecting his magical heritage entirely or submitting to expectations he felt unprepared to meet. Living with the Tonks family would mean leaving Privet Drive, leaving the only home he had ever known, but perhaps it also meant the possibility of finding out who he could become when he wasn't fighting merely to survive each day. I need to think about it, Harry said finally. Not because I don't want to. I do. I think I really do. But because I want to be sure I'm making the right choice for the right reasons. Of course, Ted nodded approvingly. Smart decision. Take whatever time you need. But, Andromeda added with a slight smile, remember that sometimes the right choice is simply the one that offers you the chance to find out who you really are. After the Tonks family left, Harry retreated to his small bedroom and sat by the window, looking out at the perfectly ordinary street where he had spent the first 11 years of his life. Mrs. Figg's house across the way showed a warm light in the front window, and he found himself wondering how many other people in Little Whinging were keeping secrets about the larger world, beyond these suburban boundaries. Tomorrow would bring another decision, another crossroads in a summer that had already changed everything about his understanding of his place in the world. But for the first time since this all began, Harry felt like he was moving towards something rather than running away from it. The choice between staying and going had become the choice between remaining hidden and stepping into the light of who he might become. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter thought he might be ready to find out what that looked like. Harry had always been good at reading the spaces between words, the careful silences that followed loaded questions. It was a skill born of necessity, honed through years of gauging Uncle Vernon's mood by the set of his shoulders or determining whether Aunt Petunia's pursed lips meant mild irritation or genuine fury. So when Ted Tonks suggested they take a walk through the neighborhood while Andromeda finished her conversation with the Dursleys, Harry understood that this was not really about exercise or fresh air. They walked in comfortable silence for nearly 10 minutes, past the identical lawns and carefully maintained gardens of Privet Drive, before Ted spoke. You know, when Andromeda first suggested we visit you, I wasn't entirely convinced it was the right approach, Ted said, his hands clasped behind his back as they strolled. Not because I didn't think you deserved better than this place, but because I wondered if we were just another set of adults trying to make decisions for you without asking what you actually wanted. Harry glanced sideways at this man who had appeared on his doorstep, offering something that sounded too good to be true. Ted Tonks had the kind of face that seemed incapable of deception, open, honest, with laugh lines that suggested he found genuine joy in everyday things. It was unsettling in a way to be around an adult who didn't seem to be performing or calculating or working toward some hidden agenda. "What changed your mind?" Harry asked. "Watching you think," Ted replied without hesitation. "Most children your age, when offered something they want, they grab it immediately. No questions, no consideration of consequences. But you've been thinking about this for hours, weighing options, considering what it might mean. That tells me you've learned to be careful about hope, which means you've been disappointed before." They had reached the small park at the end of Wisteria Walk, and Ted settled onto one of the benches facing the playground equipment. Harry sat beside him, leaving a careful distance between them, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to run if necessary. "The thing is, Harry, I don't think this decision should be made quickly or lightly. Not by you, and certainly not by us. If you came to live with Andromeda and me, it wouldn't be temporary. We're not looking for a project or a good deed or a way to feel better about ourselves. We're looking for a son." The word hit Harry with unexpected force. Son. Not ward, not charge, not responsibility. Son. "I don't know how to be somebody's son," Harry said quietly, the admission falling from his lips before he could stop it. Ted's expression grew gentle without becoming pitying, which Harry appreciated more than he could express. "I don't know how to be somebody's father either. Andromeda and I, we never had children of our own. Not by choice, exactly, just life had other plans. So we'd be learning together, which seems fair." A group of younger children had appeared in the playground, their shouts and laughter creating a backdrop of normalcy that somehow made this conversation feel both more real and more surreal. Harry watched them play, noting the easy way they moved through space without checking over their shoulders, without calculating the mood of nearby adults, without the constant low-level vigilance that had become second nature to him. "What would happen to my magic?" Harry asked, because it seemed important to understand all the implications before making such a momentous decision. "Whatever you wanted to happen to it," Ted replied. "If you wanted to learn, we could arrange tutoring. If you decided you wanted to attend Hogwarts after all, we could support that choice. If you preferred to explore Muggle education, we could do that too. The point is that it would be your choice, made when you felt ready to make it." Harry turned to study Ted's profile, looking for signs of the careful management he had come to expect from adults when they discussed his future. But Ted simply sat watching the children play, apparently content to let Harry process this information at his own pace. "Would I have to change my name?" The question surprised Harry as much as it seemed to surprise Ted, who turned to look at him with raised eyebrows. "Why would you need to change your name?" "I don't know," Harry said, feeling foolish now for asking. "I just thought, if I became part of your family." "Harry Potter," Ted said firmly, "is a perfectly good name. It's your name, and it connects you to your parents and your history. Why would we want you to give that up?" Something tight in Harry's chest began to loosen, though he couldn't quite name what it was. He had been prepared for conditions, for expectations, for the kind of bargaining that came with any significant change in his circumstances. The absence of such conditions was almost more difficult to process than their presence would have been. "What about the wizarding world? They seem to have very strong opinions about where I should be and what I should be doing." Ted's expression darkened slightly, the first sign of genuine anger Harry had seen from him. "The wizarding world has had 11 years to ensure your welfare, Harry. They placed you with relatives who clearly resented your presence and then failed to follow up on your care. As far as I'm concerned, They've forfeited any claim to dictate your future. There was steel beneath Ted's gentle manner, Harry realized. This was not a man who would be easily intimidated by ministry officials or Hogwarts professors or anyone else who might decide they knew what was best for Harry Potter. Andromeda has some experience dealing with wizarding bureaucracy, Ted continued, his tone lightening again. Being disowned by one of the sacred 28 families gives you a certain perspective on their politics. She won't let them bully you, or us. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. Harry found himself imagining what it might feel like to live somewhere he was wanted rather than merely tolerated, to have adults who asked his opinion rather than simply informing him of decisions they had already made. The possibility seemed so foreign to his experience that he struggled to make it feel real. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said eventually. "Of course." "Why me? I mean, if you wanted to adopt a child, there must be other children who need families. Children who don't come with famous names and complicated histories and people trying to use them for political purposes." Ted was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You're right that there are other children who need families," he said finally. "And you're right that taking you in would bring complications that wouldn't exist otherwise. But here's the thing, Harry. We're not looking for just any child. We're looking for you. But you don't know me." "We know enough," Ted said simply. "We know you're thoughtful and careful and kind. We know you've survived circumstances that would have broken many adults. We know you're brave enough to refuse something that most people would consider a tremendous honor because it didn't feel right to you. Those are the qualities we care about, not your fame or your history or what other people expect from you." A small girl with pigtails had fallen from the monkey bars and begun to cry. Without thinking, Harry started to get up, some instinct to help overriding his usual caution around strangers. Ted placed a gentle hand on his arm, not restraining him but grounding him. "Her mother's already there," Ted murmured. And indeed, a woman had appeared from nowhere to scoop up the crying child and offer comfort. "But the fact that your first impulse was to help tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Harry settled back onto the bench, embarrassed by how transparent his reactions were to this man who barely knew him. "You don't need to decide today," Ted said gently. "This isn't an ultimatum or a limited-time offer. Take whatever time you need to think about it. Talk to anyone you trust. Consider all your options. We'll still be here when you're ready to give us an answer." "What if I'm never ready?" Harry asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of his mind. "What if I'm too damaged by living here to be anybody's son?" Ted turned to face him fully, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Harry, let me tell you something. Every child deserves to be loved and protected and valued for who they are. That's not something you have to earn or prove you're worthy of. It's something that should be given freely, simply because you exist. If the adults in your life haven't provided that, the failure is theirs, not yours." The words hit Harry like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were kind. He had spent so many years believing that love was something he had to deserve, that affection was conditional on good behavior and useful silence. The idea that he might be worth caring about simply because he was Harry Potter, not the boy who lived, not the symbol of Voldemort's defeat, but just Harry, was almost too radical to accept. "I want to say yes," Harry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared." "Of course you are," Ted said matter-of-factly. "It would be strange if you weren't. Making big changes is frightening, especially when you've learned that adults can't always be trusted to keep their promises. But being scared doesn't mean you're making the wrong choice. Sometimes it just means you're making a brave one. When they walked back to number 4 Privet Drive 20 minutes later, Harry felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his own possibilities. The house looked the same. The street looked the same. Even the Dursleys would probably look the same when he walked through the front door. But he was different now, carrying the knowledge that someone, 2 someones actually, wanted him for reasons that had nothing to do with destiny or duty or political advantage. Andromeda was waiting in the front garden when they returned, her expression suggesting that her conversation with the Dursleys had not been entirely pleasant. She looked up as they approached, her gaze moving from Ted's face to Harry's and back again. "How are we doing?" she asked, and Harry understood that she was asking both of them. "We're thinking," Ted replied, which seemed to satisfy her. "Good," Andromeda said firmly. "Thinking is important. Rush into nothing, Harry. When you're ready to decide, we'll be ready to listen." Standing there between these 2 adults who were offering him something he had never dared to hope for, Harry felt the last of his resistance begin to crumble. They weren't pushing him toward a decision, weren't overwhelming him with promises or conditions or expectations. They were simply offering him space to be a child, making a choice about his own life. Perhaps for the first time since he had been old enough to make choices at all. "I think," Harry said carefully, testing the words as he spoke them, "I would like to try being your son." The smiles that broke across both their faces were worth every moment of fear and uncertainty that had brought him to this point. Chapter 11. Harry made his decision on a Tuesday morning while watching Uncle Vernon prepare for another day of aggressive normalcy. His uncle moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had built his entire identity around the predictable rhythms of suburban life, and Harry realized with sudden clarity that he could not spend another year watching that performance from the outside. The Dursleys had given him a roof over his head and food to eat, but they had also taught him that love was conditional, that belonging was something earned through perfect behavior and silent acceptance of whatever role others assigned to him. The wizarding world had offered him fame and expectation, a predetermined destiny that felt no more authentic than Uncle Vernon's forced cheerfulness. But the Tonks family had offered him something different, the chance to discover who he might become when he was neither hidden nor displayed, neither ignored nor worshipped, but simply accepted as a child with his own thoughts, fears, and possibilities. Harry waited until Uncle Vernon had left for work, and Dudley had departed for his summer boxing lessons before approaching Aunt Petunia in the kitchen. She was washing dishes with the same mechanical efficiency her husband brought to his morning routine, her thin shoulders tense with the awareness that their household's carefully maintained equilibrium was about to shift permanently. "I'm going to go with them," Harry said quietly. Aunt Petunia's hands stilled in the soapy water. For a long moment, she didn't turn around, and Harry wondered if she was relieved or concerned, or some combination of emotions she couldn't afford to acknowledge. "When?" she asked finally, her voice carefully neutral. "They said they'd come back today if I was ready. I think I am." Petunia turned then, and Harry was surprised to see something that might have been regret in her pale eyes. "You've decided, then, about all of it?" "About leaving here," Harry clarified. "About living with people who want me around. The rest, I'll figure out the rest as I go." She nodded slowly, and for a moment Harry glimpsed the woman she might have been if fear hadn't shaped so many of her choices. "I hope," she said carefully, "that you find what you're looking for." It wasn't an apology for the 11 years of coldness and casual cruelty, but it was perhaps as close as Petunia Dursley could come to acknowledging that Harry deserved better than what she had been able to give him. When Ted and Andromeda Tonks arrived that afternoon, they brought with them a sense of quiet competence that made the practical aspects of Harry's departure feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Ted handled the legal documentation with the ministry, while Andromeda helped Harry pack his few possessions and offered gentle suggestions about what he might want to take with him versus what could be left behind. "Your photo albums," she said firmly, when Harry hesitated over the small collection of pictures Mrs. Figg had shared with him over the years. "Photographs become more precious with time, not less." Harry packed his books carefully, including the magical texts Mrs. Figg had lent him, and the few Muggle novels he had managed to acquire from the school library. His clothes fit easily into a single bag, and he found himself oddly grateful for how little he had accumulated during his years at Privet Drive. Moving forward would be easier when there was less to leave behind. The most difficult conversation came when Mrs. Figg appeared at the front door, just as they were preparing to leave. Harry had seen her watching from her window for the past hour, and he had known this moment was inevitable. "So you've made your choice," she said simply, studying his face with the careful attention she had always given him. "I think it's the right one," Harry replied, meaning it. Mrs. Figg nodded slowly, then surprised him by stepping forward and pulling him into a brief, fierce hug. "You deserve people who will help you figure out who you want to become," she murmured into his hair. "I'm glad you found them." When she released him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Remember," she said quietly, "that choosing a different path doesn't mean rejecting everything you've learned here. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable ones, even when we wish we hadn't needed to learn them." The drive to the Tonks house in Kent felt like travelling between worlds, though the landscape remained resolutely English throughout the journey. Ted kept up a gentle flow of conversation about the area they were moving to, the neighbours they might meet, and the school options available if Harry decided he wanted to pursue formal education. Andromeda added occasional details about their daughter Nymphadora, who was currently working in London but visited regularly, and about the garden Ted had been expanding since they had moved to the house 5 years earlier. "It's not a grand estate," Andromeda said, as they turned into a tree-lined drive. "But it's home, and there's room for you to find your own space within it." The house that came into view was nothing like Privet Drive's rigid conformity or the imposing grandeur Harry associated with magical estates. It was a comfortable 2-story home, with ivy climbing the brick walls and windows that caught the late afternoon sunlight. The garden Ted had mentioned was clearly a work of love, with flower beds that showed the careful attention of someone who found genuine pleasure in growing things. "Your room is upstairs," Andromeda said as they entered the front hall. "We thought you might like to see it before we get too settled." The room she showed him was larger than his cupboard at Privet Drive, with windows that looked out over the garden and bookshelves that were clearly meant to be filled. There was a desk positioned to catch the morning light, and a bed that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than mere function. "We can change anything you don't like," Ted said from the doorway. "Paint, furniture, layout. Whatever would make it feel more like yours." Harry stood in the center of the room and tried to absorb the reality that this space was being offered to him without conditions or expectations beyond his basic happiness. The concept was so foreign to his previous experience that he found himself struggling to formulate a response. "It's perfect," he said finally, and meant it. That evening, as Harry helped Ted prepare dinner, while Andromeda wrote letters to various ministry officials informing them of the change in his guardianship, he found himself thinking about the conversation Mrs. Figg had initiated months earlier about choices and consequences. He had chosen to refuse Hogwarts, and that choice had led him here, to this warm kitchen with these kind people who were asking him about his preferences for vegetables, rather than lecturing him about destiny or duty. Perhaps the original letter had been less about forcing him into a predetermined role, and more about opening a door to discovering what he actually wanted his life to become. "Penny for your thoughts?" Andromeda asked, looking up from her correspondence. Harry considered his answer carefully. "I'm thinking about how strange it is that saying no to one thing led me to something I actually want to say yes to." Andromeda smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "That," she said warmly, "is exactly how choices are supposed to work." Outside, the sun was setting over the Kent countryside, and Harry Potter was learning what it felt like to be somewhere he belonged, not because of what he represented to others, but because of who he was when no one was asking him to be anything more than himself. The conversation with Uncle Vernon went about as well as Harry had expected, which was to say, it involved a great deal of shouting, several threats about ungrateful freaks, and a disturbing shade of purple that seemed to consume Vernon's entire face. Aunt Petunia stood in the kitchen doorway throughout the exchange, her thin arms crossed, saying nothing but watching everything with the sharp attention of someone cataloguing details for future reference. "You can't just take him," Vernon bellowed, jabbing a thick finger in Andromeda's direction. "We're his legal guardians. We have rights." "You have responsibilities," Andromeda replied coolly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of privilege and the unshakable confidence that came with being absolutely correct. "Responsibilities you have clearly failed to meet. Would you prefer to discuss this matter with the local authorities, or shall we handle the transition quietly?" Harry had never seen Uncle Vernon deflate quite so quickly. The mention of authorities, any authorities, seemed to drain the fight out of him with remarkable efficiency. Vernon's relationship with officialdom was complicated by his determination to appear respectable, while simultaneously avoiding any scrutiny that might reveal the less respectable aspects of his character. "What about his things?" Aunt Petunia asked, speaking for the first time since the conversation had begun. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Harry caught the slight emphasis on the word "things," as though she were questioning whether he had anything worth taking. "We'll manage," Ted said gently. He had been standing quietly beside Harry throughout Vernon's tirade, not quite touching, but close enough that Harry could feel the warmth of his presence. Harry doesn't need much, and what he does need, we can provide. It was true, of course. Harry's possessions could fit into a single trunk with room to spare. 11 years of living in a cupboard, followed by 2 years in Dudley's second bedroom, had not provided many opportunities to accumulate belongings. His school books, a few items of clothing that actually fit him, the broken toys Dudley had discarded and Harry had quietly repaired in secret. It wasn't much to show for a childhood, but it was his. "I'll go pack," Harry said, wanting to escape the tension that filled the front room like a noxious gas. "I'll help," Andromeda offered, following him toward the stairs. Harry's bedroom, former bedroom, he corrected himself, looked smaller somehow when viewed through Andromeda's eyes. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sparse furnishings, the broken window latch, the way the door handle had been removed and inexpertly reattached. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but Harry saw her fingers tighten around the doorframe. "This has been your room for 2 years?" she asked quietly. "It's better than the cupboard," Harry replied, pulling his trunk from under the bed. The statement was meant to be reassuring, but he realized immediately that it had the opposite effect. Andromeda's face went very still in the way that suggested she was working hard to control her reaction. "The cupboard," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Harry busied himself with folding his few decent shirts, uncertain how to respond to the dangerous edge that had crept into her tone. "Under the stairs. I lived there until my Hogwarts letter came. The Dursleys thought people might ask questions if they knew, so they moved me up here." "I see." The words came out clipped and precise, each syllable carefully controlled. How considerate of them. They packed in silence for several minutes, Andromeda helping him fold clothes with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was using the mundane task to process information she found disturbing. Harry appreciated that she didn't ask questions about the cupboard, didn't demand details about sleeping arrangements or meals or any of the other small cruelties that had defined his early childhood. She simply accepted his few belongings with the same matter-of-fact kindness she had shown since arriving on Privet Drive. "These books," she said, picking up one of the magical texts Mrs. Fig had lent him. "You've been studying?" "A little," Harry admitted. "Mrs. Fig thought I should know something about my heritage, even if I wasn't going to Hogwarts." Andromeda opened the book to a page Harry had marked with a piece of torn paper, scanning the chapter on magical theory with interest. "You understand this?" "Some of it. The theoretical parts, anyway. I can't do much practical magic without a wand, and I wasn't sure I wanted one." "But you were curious enough to read about it." Harry nodded, unsure whether this was a good thing or a bad thing in her estimation. "It seemed important to understand what I was giving up, if I was going to give it up." "Very sensible," Andromeda said, closing the book and placing it carefully in his trunk. "Knowledge is never wasted, Harry. Whatever you decide about formal magical education, understanding your heritage is valuable." When they returned downstairs 20 minutes later, they found Ted and Vernon engaged in what could charitably be called a conversation, though it bore more resemblance to a negotiation between hostile nations. Papers had appeared on the coffee table, official-looking documents that Vernon was scanning with the suspicious attention of someone who expected to find hidden clauses and unpleasant surprises. "These transfer papers are in order," Vernon muttered, clearly disappointed to find nothing objectionable in the legal language. "Though I don't see why we need all this bureaucratic nonsense. If you want to take him, take him." "Because doing things properly protects everyone," Ted replied patiently. "Harry's welfare, your legal position, our responsibility, it's all documented now." Harry understood that Ted was being diplomatic, but he suspected the real reason for the paperwork had more to do with preventing Vernon from changing his mind or making difficulties later. The documents made the transition official in ways that would be difficult to reverse, which seemed like exactly the kind of protection Harry needed. Aunt Petunia appeared in the doorway as Harry set his trunk by the front door. She looked at the small collection of his worldly possessions with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief, perhaps, or regret, or some complicated mixture of both. "You have everything?" she asked. Harry nodded, though everything felt like an overstatement for one trunk and a small bag of books. "Good." She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate, before reaching into her apron pocket and withdrawing a small wrapped package. "This was your mother's," she said, pressing it into his hands before he could react. "I should have given it to you years ago." The package was light, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. Harry could feel something small and hard inside. But he made no move to unwrap it with everyone watching. Instead, he simply nodded and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly, and meant it. Petunia's smile was fleeting and complicated, there and gone so quickly Harry almost thought he had imagined it. "Be well, Harry," she murmured, and then she was retreating to the kitchen, leaving the rest of them to handle the practicalities of departure. The drive to the Tonks house in Kent took place in a strange state of suspended reality. Harry sat in the back seat of Ted's car, watching the familiar landmarks of Little Whinging disappear behind them, and found himself struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. This morning, he had been Harry Potter, reluctant celebrity, living unhappily with relatives who resented his presence. Now he was... What? Harry Potter, prospective son of two people who seemed to actually want him around? "Are you all right?" Andromeda asked from the front passenger seat, turning to check on him with the kind of casual concern that suggested she had been doing so throughout the drive. "I think so," Harry replied, which was as honest as he could manage. "It doesn't feel real yet." "That's normal," Ted said from the driver's seat. "Big changes take time to sink in. There's no need to figure it all out today." The house, when they finally arrived, was nothing like Privet Drive, where the Dursleys' neighborhood was all rigid conformity and aggressive normalcy. This felt organic, settled, comfortable in its own skin. The house itself was old, but well-maintained, with ivy climbing the brick walls and gardens that looked like they had been shaped by years of loving attention rather than stern geometric principles. "Welcome home," Andromeda said as they pulled into the driveway, and the word home hit Harry with unexpected force. The interior of the house was warm and lived in, full of books and comfortable furniture, and the kind of accumulated details that came from years of shared life. There were photographs on the mantelpiece. Ted and Andromeda at their wedding, a young woman with violently pink hair who had to be Nymphadora, various family gatherings, and casual moments preserved in silver frames. "Your room is upstairs," Ted said, carrying Harry's trunk with the ease of someone who genuinely didn't mind the burden. "We can arrange things however you like. New furniture, different colors, whatever would make you comfortable." The room they showed him was larger than any space that had ever belonged to him before. It had windows that actually opened, bookshelves that were clearly meant to be filled, and a bed that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than mere function. There was even a desk positioned to catch the morning light, as though someone had assumed he might want to study, or read, or simply sit and think. "It's perfect," Harry said, meaning it. "We can change anything you don't like," Andromeda assured him, but Harry shook his head. "No, it's more than I expected." Ted and Andromeda exchanged one of those quick, wordless communications that seemed to be the privilege of long-married couples, and Harry wondered what information had passed between them that he had missed. "Why don't you get settled?" Ted suggested. "Dinner won't be ready for an hour or so, and you might want some time to yourself after such a big day." They left him alone with his possessions and his thoughts, closing the door behind them with the quiet consideration of people who understood the value of privacy. Harry stood in the center of his new room, his room, and tried to absorb the reality of his situation. He was free. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, sudden and overwhelming, and almost too large to process. He was free of the Dursleys, free of the constant vigilance that had defined his childhood, free of the need to make himself small and quiet and unobtrusive. For the first time in his life, he was somewhere he was actively wanted rather than merely tolerated. Harry sat on the edge of his new bed and carefully unwrapped the package Aunt Petunia had given him. Inside the yellowed tissue paper was a small, delicate chain bracelet, clearly meant for a woman, with a tiny charm in the shape of a lily. It was simple and beautiful, and it had belonged to his mother. He fastened it around his wrist, where it hung loosely but securely, and thought about Lily Potter, who had died to save him, and whose memory had been preserved in this small, precious thing by a sister who had resented her magic, but couldn't bring herself to throw away this last connection. When Andromeda called him down to dinner an hour later, Harry descended the stairs, feeling like he was walking into a completely different life. The kitchen was warm and filled with the kind of comfortable chaos that came from people who actually enjoyed cooking together. Ted was setting the table while Andromeda finished something that smelled absolutely wonderful at the stove. "I hope you like shepherd's pie," she said, glancing over her shoulder at him. "Ted claims it's my one truly successful recipe." "I like everything," Harry replied automatically, then realized how that sounded and felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Good," Ted said cheerfully, apparently missing the implications entirely. "Because Andromeda cooks with enthusiasm rather than precision, so there's always an element of surprise involved." They ate dinner at a proper dining table, with cloth napkins and conversation that ranged from books to gardening to magical theory. No one shouted, no one criticized the food, no one made cutting remarks about ungrateful freeloaders or freakish behavior. It was so normal, so comfortable, so fundamentally kind that Harry found himself struggling not to cry. "Are you all right?" Andromeda asked gently, noticing his distress. "I'm fine," Harry said quickly. "It's just, this is nice, really nice." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the gesture warm and natural and completely without calculation. "This is what dinner should be like," she said simply. "Every night, if we're lucky." Later that evening, as Harry lay in his new bed, in his new room, in his new life, he thought about the chain around his wrist, and the conversation at dinner, and the way Ted and Andromeda had said good night to him, as though they genuinely meant it. For the first time in his memory, he fell asleep feeling safe, and wanted, and home. Chapter 12. 3 weeks after Harry Potter moved in with the Tonks family, Minister Cornelius Fudge received a report that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The boy who lived was thriving in obscurity. The report, compiled by Arthur Weasley at the minister's request, painted a picture of a child who was finally being allowed to simply exist. Harry had begun helping Ted with the garden, spent his mornings reading in the comfortable library the Tonks family had accumulated over the years, and showed a particular interest in learning about the practical applications of magic in everyday life, not the grand gestures of power that had defined his early fame, but the small enchantments that made household tasks easier and life more pleasant. "He's not rejecting his magical heritage," Arthur had written in his careful script. "He's exploring it at his own pace, without the pressure of external expectations or institutional obligations. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter is being allowed to discover who he wants to become, rather than being told who he should be." Fudge set the report aside with mixed feelings. The crisis that had consumed so much of his attention over the summer appeared to be resolving itself in a way that satisfied most of the interested parties. The boy was safe, he was in a proper wizarding household, and he was no longer actively rejecting his place in their world. The potential for public relations disaster had been averted. But Fudge also recognized that this resolution came with its own complications. Harry Potter was no longer the malleable symbol the wizarding world had expected him to become. He was developing into something more complex, a young man who would make his own choices about how much of their world he wanted to embrace. In Kent, Harry was discovering that magic, when stripped of the weight of expectation and fear, was actually quite wonderful. Ted Tonks had begun teaching him simple household charms, and Harry found enormous satisfaction in learning to mend torn books with a whispered incantation, or to coax flowers to bloom more vibrantly in the garden beds. "Magic works best," Ted had explained on a particularly sunny morning as they worked together among the roses, "when it feels like a natural extension of who you are, rather than a performance for other people." Harry had practiced the flower-blooming charm until his fingers tingled with residual magic, and he thought he was beginning to understand what Ted meant. This felt nothing like the desperate, uncontrolled bursts of accidental magic he had experienced at Privet Drive. This felt like coming home to himself. Andromeda had taken on the task of filling in the gaps in Harry's education about his own heritage, but she approached it with a delicacy that honored his previous trauma. She told him stories about his parents that focused on who they had been as people, rather than what they had accomplished as symbols. She shared photographs that showed James and Lily Potter laughing with friends, studying in the library, arguing playfully over Quidditch matches and homework assignments. They were brilliant, she told him one evening, as they looked through an album Ted had borrowed from Remus Lupin. But more than that, they were kind. They chose to fight because they couldn't stand to see people suffer, not because they wanted glory or recognition. Harry studied a photograph of his parents at their wedding, noting how young they looked, how genuinely happy. "Do you think they would approve of my choices?" he asked quietly. "I think," Andromeda said carefully, "that they would be proud that you're thoughtful enough to make choices at all. They fought for a world where children could grow up safe and loved and free to become whoever they wanted to be. You're living proof that they succeeded." The first owl from Hogwarts arrived on a Thursday morning in late August, bearing a letter from Professor McGonagall that was notably different in tone from her previous correspondence. "Mr. Potter," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and settling comfortably into your new living situation. I am writing to inform you that your name remains on the Hogwarts enrollment list, and a place will be held for you should you choose to pursue formal magical education at any point in the future. I have spoken with Mr. and Mrs. Tonks about the possibility of alternative educational arrangements, should you prefer a less traditional approach to learning about magic. There are provisions within our charter for individual study programs and delayed enrollment, and I would be happy to discuss these options with you when and if you feel ready to do so. Please know that Hogwarts will welcome you whenever you choose to walk through our doors, whether that is next month, next year, or several years from now. Your education should serve your needs and interests, not the expectations of others. With warm regards, Professor M. McGonagall." Deputy Headmistress Harry read the letter twice before showing it to Ted and Andromeda. The absence of urgency or pressure in McGonagall's words was striking, and he found himself genuinely considering the possibility of magical education for the first time since receiving his original acceptance letter. "What do you think?" Andromeda asked, after reading the professor's offer. "I think," Harry said slowly, "that I might want to learn more about magic. Not because I have to, but because I want to understand it better. The way Ted's been teaching me, but maybe more comprehensive." "There's no rush," Ted reminded him gently. "You could start with tutoring, see how that feels. Or you could wait another year and enter Hogwarts as a second-year student. Or you could design something entirely different." Harry nodded, feeling for the first time that he had genuine options rather than ultimatums disguised as choices. "I'd like to try tutoring first," he decided. "Learn some basics here, where it's safe to ask questions and make mistakes. Then maybe eventually I might want to see what Hogwarts has to offer." "Then that's what we'll arrange," Andromeda said firmly. That afternoon, Harry received another visitor, one he had been expecting since moving to Kent. Nymphadora Tonks appeared on the front doorstep, with her characteristic bright purple hair and an irreverent grin that immediately put Harry at ease. "So you're the famous Harry Potter who's been causing such a fuss by having the audacity to think for himself," she said by way of introduction. "I'm just Harry," he replied, echoing the phrase that had become something of a personal motto. "Good," Tonks said approvingly. "Famous is overrated. Trust me, I've seen what it does to people. Much better to be interesting." Over dinner, Tonks regaled them with carefully edited stories from her work as an auror, and Harry found himself laughing more than he had in years. She treated him neither as a celebrity nor as a damaged child in need of careful handling, but simply as her parents' new foster son who happened to have an unusual history. "The thing about making your own choices," she told him as they walked through the garden after dinner, "is that you have to be prepared for other people to have opinions about them. But here's the secret. Their opinions don't actually change anything about whether your choices are right for you." "How do you know if you're making the right choices?" Harry asked. Tonks considered this seriously. "I think the right choice is usually the one that helps you become more yourself, not less. The choice that opens doors rather than closing them. The choice that comes from hope rather than fear." As summer faded into autumn, Harry Potter settled into a rhythm of life that was unprecedented in his experience. He woke each morning in a house where he was genuinely wanted, spent his days learning about magic in an environment that encouraged curiosity rather than punishing ignorance, and fell asleep each night knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same gentle acceptance. He wrote letters to Mrs. Figg, sharing details about his magical education and the progress of Ted's garden. He exchanged occasional correspondence with Professor McGonagall about academic possibilities for the following year. He helped Andromeda with her research into magical lore, discovering an unexpected aptitude for organizing complex information. And slowly, carefully, he began to believe that he might actually deserve the good things that were happening to him. On the anniversary of his first refusal of Hogwarts, Harry sat in the garden reading a book about magical theory, while Ted worked on a new herb bed nearby. The late summer afternoon was warm and peaceful, and Harry found himself thinking about the letter that had started it all. Those 3 words that had seemed like an ending, but had actually been the beginning of everything. "No regrets?" Andromeda asked, settling onto the bench beside him with her own book and a cup of tea. Harry considered the question seriously. A year ago, he had been a child who believed he deserved nothing better than tolerance and survival. Now he was learning what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, to have his thoughts and opinions valued, to be given space to grow into whoever he was meant to become. "No regrets," he said firmly. "Just gratitude." Andromeda smiled and returned to her reading, and Harry Potter continued learning how to be exactly who he was. Not a symbol or a savior or a burden, but simply a young man with magic in his blood and the freedom to decide what that might mean. The boy who lived had become something much more important. A boy who was finally allowed to choose how he wanted to live. And that, Harry thought, as he turned the page of his book and felt the warm sunlight on his face, was exactly as it should be. 3 weeks into his new life, Harry Potter was learning that happiness was a surprisingly difficult emotion to trust. It arrived in small, unexpected moments. The sound of Ted humming while he made morning tea, the way Andromeda left books on magical theory casually positioned where he might notice them, the simple pleasure of falling asleep in a room that belonged to him without wondering whether he would be allowed to stay there tomorrow. The adjustment had not been without its challenges. Harry had spent 11 years learning to make himself invisible, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to apologize for taking up space. These habits did not disappear overnight, simply because he now lived with people who actively wanted his company. More than once, Ted or Andromeda had found him cleaning the kitchen at dawn or attempting to repair household items that showed the slightest sign of wear, as though his continued welcome depended on proving his usefulness. "Harry," Andromeda had said gently, after discovering him trying to mend a loose doorknob with magic he barely understood and shouldn't have been able to perform without a wand. "You don't need to earn your place here. You belong here because we want you here. not because you're helpful around the house. The concept was still foreign enough to make him uncomfortable, but he was beginning to believe it might actually be true. The question of magic had resolved itself more naturally than any of them had expected. Without the pressure of formal education or the weight of external expectations, Harry found himself genuinely curious about his magical heritage for the first time. Ted had procured several basic textbooks on magical theory, and Harry had taken to reading them in the garden on sunny afternoons, asking questions that were answered with patience rather than exasperation. Magic, Ted had explained during one such afternoon session, is like any other skill. It responds better to understanding than to force, better to practice than to pressure. When you're ready to try practical applications, we'll find you proper instruction. Until then, learning how magic works is valuable in itself. Harry appreciated that no one seemed to expect immediate decisions about wands or formal education or his relationship with the broader wizarding world. The pressure that had characterized every interaction with magical authority figures since his Hogwarts letter arrived had been completely absent from his conversations with Ted and Andromeda. They answered his questions, offered resources when he expressed interest, and otherwise allowed him to explore at his own pace. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Harry was helping Andromeda with her research into magical law. She had been investigating historical precedents for guardianship transfers, ostensibly for academic purposes, but really to ensure that their legal position was unassailable, when an owl arrived bearing an official ministry seal. "What do they want now?" Andromeda muttered, accepting the letter with obvious reluctance. Harry felt his stomach drop as she read, her expression shifting from irritation to surprise, to something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. "Well," she said eventually, setting the letter aside with a slight smile. "It seems Minister Fudge would like to meet with you, Harry. Officially." "To try to convince me to go to Hogwarts?" Harry asked, though he suspected the answer was more complicated than that. Actually, no. To formally acknowledge your choice and discuss what support the ministry might provide for alternative magical education. Andromeda's smile grew wider. "It seems your refusal of Hogwarts has prompted some interesting policy discussions in the upper levels of magical government." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the Ministry of Magic, and Harry spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation. He had never been to the ministry, had never met a minister for magic, had never been the subject of official governmental attention that wasn't trying to compel him toward a predetermined outcome. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly gratifying. Ted and Andromeda accompanied him, of course, appearing on either side of him as they emerged from the Flu network into the ministry atrium, with the protective solidarity of people who had no intention of allowing him to face this alone. Harry appreciated their presence more than he could express, though he found himself standing a little straighter, speaking a little more clearly, presenting himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned his own worth. Minister Fudge was not what Harry had expected. Where he had imagined someone imposing and authoritative, he found a man who seemed genuinely nervous about the meeting, clearly uncertain how to approach a conversation with someone who had politely but firmly rejected everything the wizarding world typically offered its heroes. "Mr. Potter," Fudge began, gesturing toward the chairs arranged around his office. "I want to begin by saying that the ministry respects your decision regarding Hogwarts. We may not fully understand it, but we respect it." Harry settled into his chair, flanked by Ted and Andromeda, and waited for the rest. "The question now," Fudge continued, "is how best to support your magical education going forward. The wizarding world has a vested interest in ensuring that you have access to proper training, regardless of the institutional framework you choose." "What exactly are you proposing?" Andromeda asked, her tone politely skeptical. "Private tutoring, for a start. Master-level instruction in whatever areas of magic interest him most, funded by the Ministry and conducted at his convenience rather than according to academic calendars. Access to restricted texts and research materials that are normally available only to advanced students. Essentially, a personalized magical education that allows him to pursue his interests without the constraints of traditional schooling." Harry found himself genuinely surprised by the offer. He had expected attempts to change his mind, not adaptation to his choices. "Why?" he asked directly. "Why offer this instead of just insisting I go to Hogwarts like everyone else?" Fudge's expression grew thoughtful. "Because, Mr. Potter, the wizarding world has spent 11 years assuming we knew what was best for you, without asking what you wanted for yourself. Your refusal of Hogwarts was educational for those of us in positions of authority. It reminded us that having power over someone's circumstances doesn't automatically grant wisdom about their needs." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details of tutoring arrangements, legal protections for Harry's autonomy, and the Ministry's commitment to supporting whatever path he chose for his future. By the time they left, Harry had agreed to begin advanced magical instruction with a series of carefully selected tutors to be conducted at the Tonks house according to a schedule that prioritized his comfort and interest over bureaucratic convenience. "Well," Ted said as they emerged from the Ministry building into the afternoon sunlight, "that went better than expected." "Much better," Andromeda agreed, though her tone carried a note of lingering suspicion. "I'll be curious to see whether their actions match their promises." Harry said nothing, but found himself thinking about the difference between being coerced toward a decision and being supported in the decision you had already made. For the first time since receiving his Hogwarts letter, he felt like the adult world was working with him rather than against him. That evening brought another surprise in the form of Nymphadora Tonks, who arrived for dinner with her hair an alarming shade of electric blue and a grin that immediately put Harry at ease. "So you're the famous Harry Potter who's been causing such a stir by having the audacity to think for himself," she said by way of introduction, settling into her chair with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. "Just Harry," he replied, offering the phrase that had become something of a personal motto. "Good answer," she said approvingly. "Fame is overrated. Trust me, I've seen what it does to people's judgment. Much better to be interesting than important." Dinner conversation ranged from Nymphadora's work as an aura, carefully edited for content but enthusiastically delivered, to Harry's experience with the Ministry that afternoon, to Ted's ongoing battle with the garden slugs that seemed determined to destroy his lettuce crop. It was comfortable and chaotic, and filled with the kind of easy affection that Harry was still learning to accept as normal. "The thing about making your own choices," Nymphadora told him, as they walked through the garden after dinner, her hair fading from blue to a more conventional brown in the twilight, "is that you have to be prepared for other people to have opinions about them. But here's the secret. Their opinions don't actually change anything about whether your choices are right for you." "How do you know if you're making the right choices?" Harry asked, echoing a question he had posed to Ted weeks earlier. "I think the right choice is usually the one that helps you become more yourself, not less. The choice that opens doors rather than closing them. The choice that comes from hope rather than fear." She paused, studying his face in the fading light. "From what I can see, you're doing just fine on that front." Later that night, as Harry sat in his room reading one of the advanced magical theory texts the Ministry had provided, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, He had been a boy living in a cupboard, convinced that he deserved nothing better than the scraps of affection that occasionally fell his way. Now he was someone with choices, with support, with a future that stretched out before him, full of possibilities rather than predetermined obligations. The refusal of Hogwarts that had seemed like an ending had turned out to be a beginning. By saying no to what others expected him to want, he had discovered what he actually did want. Knowledge pursued for its own sake, magic learned at his own pace, a family chosen rather than imposed, and the freedom to become whoever he was meant to be without the weight of external expectations. Harry touched the chain around his wrist, his mother's bracelet that connected him to a past he barely remembered, and thought about the letter that had started it all. 3 words, "I'm not interested," had seemed so final when he had written them. Now he understood that they had really been the first words of a conversation about his own agency, his own worth, his own right to determine the shape of his life. Tomorrow would bring the first of his private tutoring sessions, a chance to explore magic on his own terms with instructors who had been chosen for their ability to teach rather than their dedication to institutional conformity. Next week would bring another family dinner, another opportunity to practice being someone who was wanted rather than merely tolerated. Next month would bring new questions, new choices, new opportunities to define himself according to his own standards rather than others' expectations. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was looking forward to his future.